Smashing the table, he declared articulately, "This attack is for money and women." Not bad. Gangder cheered, and Ola's eye lit up as well. We're snatching women? I like this. Flozan smiled faintly. I like this too. The elven bard paused for a moment, glancing at Flozan. It was difficult to continue with this topic, since what Flozan had said sounded extremely ridiculous, but of course there were all sorts of eccentrics in the nobility. Ola also couldn't make out whether she was serious or sarcastic, so he shut his mouth. There were only tough battles ahead. Smart people would know to stay out of trouble and avoid offending the priestess. The trolls clearly didn't think as deeply as the elf. Medium Rare immediately followed up with a shout, "Let's get troll women too, dot." Of course. If we meet any, we'll take as many as we can. Richard replied with a smile. And thus, a chaotic rally to arms came to an end. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 27. A sudden attack. Richard spread out a map on the table, pointing to a small town. This is Hoven, the target of our attack. Unlike Osfa, Hoven was quite large and prosperous. It connected many towns in the mountains to the Baron's castle, making it a hub for materials like wood, ore, and hide. The town's position also made it a supply point for adventurers that many preferred to Osfa. With a total of more than 500 families and 2,000 citizens, the town had many shops. Adventurers could easily find the supplies they needed here, with everything from blacksmiths to goldsmiths. The only building missing was a church, but the only one in the barony was in its capital. That was one grand building, built to prove Baron Forza's devotion. It was as expensive to build and maintain churches as they were big, however, so the Baron wouldn't be able to afford a second in his territory. Hoven was also Sir Kojo's fief. He normally lived in a large estate outside the town, with a training camp for his soldiers being nearby. The 30-odd elite warriors under his command were normally stationed in that camp. However, that camp was now deserted, with the only ones there now being a few of his younger retainers. All of the warriors had followed their lord on an expedition to kill the invaders, but none had returned. As a result, the knight's manor had been packed densely these past few days. There were a lot of guards, with frenetic, lost people all over. These guards had only been training for a short while, not even considered normal soldiers. However, with the loss of their elites, they had no choice but to call on the militia from the farmlands to make up for the guard posts. The few escapees from the second battle had returned a few days ago, bringing news of their loss. The bad news had spread like wildfire in a drought-ridden grassland, spreading quickly across the entire barony. Even Menta and Hubert had been killed, so the fate of their expedition was obvious. Nobody could predict when the demons from another plane would appear, so some of the branch families had already started packing, prepared to flee. Their actions were a result of excess panic, however, most were calm. They weren't all that far from the capital, and the Baron's troops were still there. The Church of Valor wouldn't ignore these intruders either, and Baron Forza still had Earl Jalion backing him, one of the 3 earls of the duchy. Thus, despite the panic and disturbance, the people of Hoven would be able to survive another night. Hoven was about 40 kilometers away from the mountain range. Since there were many mercenaries and adventurers moving through the cities, and with the occasional rebellion from those in the mountains, there was a wall surrounding the town. Kojo's estate had its own defenses as well. A fast shadow appeared before Hoven as night fell, quietly circling the town before vaulting over the 3-meter-tall walls without issue. It quickly appeared once more at Kojo's estate, wandering around and examining the terrain and defenses under the cover of the night. The militia on the arrow towers didn't even notice the new presence, letting the intruder examine key areas before leaving in the dark. 1 hour later, a sizable troop quietly appeared on the outskirts of the town. Richard looked into the distance through the darkness of the night, faintly able to see Hoven's outline. He waited patiently, and Ola soon emerged from the darkness to whisper, "There's about 50 militia in Hoven, master, weak and poorly armed." However, there are many adventurers in the town with a small mercenary troop that total another 50 as well. Those people are far better than the militia. I felt like some of them were over level 6, but I didn't dare approach them. There were many men at Kojo's manor, but they're just the militia. However, the training camp isn't far away, with almost 30 retainers there and an equal number of hired help. If needed, they'd be able to form a troop themselves. What about the warhorses? Richard voiced his main concern. The warhorses are concentrated around the estate and the training camp, about 20 in each with all of excellent quality. Richard was quite satisfied with that information. He confirmed things with the map once more, before pointing at the prisoners they'd brought along. They were good at leading the way, give them some weapons. Medium Rare took a sack of weapons and shields off his back, passing them to 5 of the captive warriors. Everyone was given a sword and a small, round wooden shield. These 5 warriors had been born commoners, with little loyalty to their lord. Under the threat of death, they chose to serve. Their head was familiar with the lay of the land, which was why Richard's forces had managed to make it to the outskirts of Hoven undetected. Richard had only brought along 3 of his knights this time, armed with shield and axe. The remaining 4 had been left at the base, tasked with guarding the prisoners who refused to capitulate. Everyone else had followed him into the attack. The estate first. The troop went under the cover of the darkness once more under Richard's orders, prowling towards Kojo's manor. Between the many contrasting silhouettes were the profiles of 3 oddly shaped beasts. The main entrance to Kojo's manor was tightly sealed, with only a small area before it lit up by some lamps. There was an archer in each of the 2 towers guarding the gate, behind the cover of the walls to scan through the darkness regularly. Although it was early into the summer, it was extremely cold that night. The wind was especially strong so far high, making the 2 soldiers stationed there suffer. One of them was already curled up, his worn-out armor was like a steel plate that was immersed in water. He was cursing at the weather under his breath, but just as he wanted to start moving he heard an extremely soft noise. The sentry immediately stood up, on his guard as he looked over the wall. However, Richard had already entered the tower like a ghost, covering his mouth with one hand as he sent a dagger through the man's back. The sentry struggled and twitched for a while, but soon grew motionless. On the other side, Ola had struck the archer down like a shadow, having him collapse immediately. Seeing that Ola had already defeated the other guard, Richard conveniently cast an elementary magic flame. It was extremely striking in the darkness, prompting many murderous silhouettes to rush out of the darkness as they pounced upon the manor. Ola leapt in as well, watching Waterflower break the lock with the Shepherd of Eternal Rest and use her strength to slowly pry the heavy doors apart. The patrolling militia discovered the gates opening, but by then it was too late. Warning whistles, screams, and alarms rang out, and the entire manor delved into chaos. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 28. A Sudden Attack, 2. A few patrolling guards burst towards the front gate with torches in hand, just in time to see a pack of armed enemies surrounding the manor. Their leader could clearly see the faces of these bandits under the torchlight, and he was able to make out a few familiar faces. He exclaimed in shock, "Pierre! Is that really you? Uncle Yeoman? Why are you guys here? Didn't you follow Sir Kojo to find those demons from another plane?" Being exposed, Pierre and Yeoman were forced to stop in their tracks. The remaining 3 of Richard's prisoners stopped as well, but despite the momentary stall the patrol couldn't figure out the situation. Gangder betrayed a cruel smile from behind the prisoners, holding tight to the axe in his hands. The knights moved forward to flank, while Waterflower remained hidden in Gangder's shadow, holding her breath. That very moment, Richard issued a cold order from the tower he was surveilling the situation from, "Yeoman. Kill them." The moment his voice sounded out, the middle-aged warrior immediately waved his sword subconsciously, almost as if he'd heard the whispers of a devil. The youth across him was stunned, looking down in disbelief at the wound on his chest. The cut was long and deep, almost revealing his internal organs. Yeoman had evidently used all his strength. That strike had hit the youth's vital points in a single strike, so fast he hadn't even had the time to react. It was a swing that broke the bones in his body, but he didn't so much as sway. It was clearly an exquisite, vicious strike. Yeoman had definitely showcased his fundamental skills as a veteran warrior with that one strike. As the sword landed, even Yeoman himself was stunned for a moment. However, he recovered immediately and took another step forward, stabbing the young guard in his abdomen. "Kill them!" A shout rang out, but this time it wasn't Richard. "Kill them all!" Yeoman was cutting down a guard with every one of those shouts, and the other prisoners seemed to awaken from their reverie as they pounced on the guards as well. Despite being outnumbered, they killed their opponents off one after the other. 7 to 8 guards had been cut down instantly between the flashes of blades. Regardless of age, all the prisoners that had accompanied Richard this time had seen blood, had deaths on their heads. How could a civilian militia hope to match them in a melee? Since the fight had already begun, the prisoners freed up their hands and feet completely, holding up shields and swords against another pack of guards who'd rushed up to provide assistance. Blood was spilled once more, the new arrivals defeated as well without a single survivor remaining. Even the ones who were critically injured weren't let go, swords slashing into or stabbing them without question. The viciousness of these men without escape caused even Gangder to shrug his shoulders. Richard had prepared a fireball, but it turned out to be of no use. He jumped down, casting a featherfall spell as he fell gracefully to the ground. A loud commotion rang out from the central and side towers at that moment, with large numbers of guards marching out. They were all disheveled, some even unarmed, but their sheer numbers would still give them an overwhelming advantage. The 5 prisoners were gasping rapidly, huddled close to each other. Every one of them was injured to some extent, but that only increased their ferocity. They glared at their former comrades with bloodshot eyes, holding firmly onto the steel swords in their hands. Flozin walked out of the dark at that moment, healing spells already falling onto the 2 most severely hurt of the lot. Although the warriors were surprised, it served to be a huge boost to their morale, but Richard was already floating in mid-air. He infused mana into his voice, screaming loudly, "Kill all who dare resist." The voice engulfed the entire manor, leaving the charging guards startled. They slowed down involuntarily, but soon they were pushed forward by the waves behind them. Their battle cries this time were exceptionally fierce, as if hoping to boost their own valor. Richard walked out of the crowd with his right arm raised, waving out a signal. A sudden, sharp hiss rang through the night sky, as a piercing arrow nailed one of the guards on the front lines dead to the ground. Richard pushed his hand down, spawning 4 brutal boars in front of him. These creatures were all blessed by Flozin the moment they emerged. 4 huge shadows galloped into enemy ranks, leaving them a huge mess. One of the boars had sunk its teeth into the waist of an unlucky chap during the charge, raising him up into the sky to the tune of piercing screams. Gangder was so excited that his face was flushed red. He rushed out of the crowd, exclaiming, "My axe can't." But at that exact moment, a loud cry rang out near him as an attack of blazing energy rushed past him. The fireball moved out farther, exploding in the midst of the patrolling guards, the edge of the explosion only a few meters away from the brute. Had he been any faster just then, leaping into the guards, he would have been bathing in fire right now. Gangder was well aware of how scary Richard could be. He could cast fireballs extremely quickly, and if the first one had exploded, that meant the second one would already have left his hands. He couldn't help but retreat, the second one would only be faster. As expected, even as the waves of the last fireball continued to spread out, another one had already flown past him, exploding between the remaining guards. In fact, these 2 fireballs also encompassed the brutal boars that were in the melee. 2 of them had broken out of Richard's control, with the first one turning to look at the culprit with revenge in their eyes. However, the second one had sent the remainder of the 4 boars and all of the 20-odd guards straight to hell. The manor fell silent at once. In a matter of seconds, with 3 spells in total, the first wave of guards had been cleared out. As they looked at the messy but now empty square, it wasn't just the opposing guards that were awestruck, even many of the people on Richard's side were secretly scared. Gangder's eyelids started to twitch vigorously. Had he not listened to Richard's orders, jumping into the crowd according to plan, he would have died to the explosions before he could wave his axe. No level 10 warrior would want to suffer a single fireball, much less 2 less than a second apart. Even a level 11 warrior wouldn't be able to recover from that. In fact, a level 12 warrior like Sir Kojo, who also had excellent armor, had been defeated by 5 of Richard's fireballs. If not for Richard taking care of the knight's subordinates, he would have been able to focus the damage on the knight and take him down with just 4. The second batch of guards were just gathering, when they suddenly cried out in alarm. They turned to leave in a hurry, escaping into the manor itself. They seemed to forget that Richard could set it ablaze with 2 of his fireballs, killing them nonetheless. Although there were still nearly 100 guards left in the manor, their will to fight had been wiped out by those 3 spells. Richard raised his right arm high once more, pointing out at the central building of the estate, "Leave the women and children alive. Kill any men who dare resist." Richard had barely finished his sentence, but Gangder had already thrown himself out like a whirlwind. His thunderous roars echoed through the night. "I've been waiting all night for this. Watch out for my tough axe, lizards. It's hungry for blood." Schlick, Gangder's axe sliced at the waist of the last of the patrol guards, nearly splitting him in half. Following that, the giant rammed his way into the main building, shouting louder than the endless cries and screams. "My axe can't handle the hunger anymore. My axe can't handle the hunger. My axe. Handle. Hunger. Hunger." The brute was evidently killing so fast he couldn't shout as fast as he killed. The prisoners, knights, raptors. Even Waterflower and Flozen rushed into the manor, leaving the trolls to block the front and rear exits with their huge bodies. However, there were still some people scurrying about, trying to escape by climbing the walls of the estate. But how would they ever escape the sight of Richard, who was standing alone on the square? All Richard had to do was to point his finger at those figures, and bows would be drawn in the dark, arrows one after another piercing through their bodies in a split second. It was like he was a god of death, ordering their lives away. In just a few short minutes, the noises from the massacre had audibly lessened. Gangder's deafening chant had also become more and more complete. A fortunate patrol guard had escaped through the back door of the main building, and cleverly jumped onto a horse in the back stable as it rushed out madly. He sped along the walls, trying to hide in the shadows of the trees as he quickly approached the now unguarded main gate. Ola quietly appeared by Richard's side, his bow long drawn. The arrowhead was burning with tracking flames, and the elf already knew that he would definitely pierce through the man's heart. Just as he was about to release, however, Richard suddenly held him back. Surprised, Ola exclaimed, "Master, he'll definitely notify the training camp." "Let him go," Richard replied calmly. A short while later, the guard safely made it out of the manor on his horse, disappearing into the darkness of the night. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 29. Trap. The battle in the manor ended quickly, and the battle outside was reaching a close as well. The women and children had been chased to a side hall, while the surrendered soldiers were locked up in several rooms. If anyone tried anything silly, there would be nothing a fire inside a sealed room would not fix. It was only then that Richard entered the manor. Such close-ranged battles were far too dangerous for a mage, especially at his level. He searched for the 3 raptors in his mind, trying to determine how much they had left in them. All 3 still had more than half their strength remaining, so even if they'd been unavoidably hurt, the result was pleasant. He ordered them to search for any hidden soldiers, bringing his own out. Dead beasts were replaceable, but his knights were not. There were more than 10 women in the side hall, with about 7 or 8 children as well, all huddled together in fear. They'd watched helplessly as their enemies appeared suddenly, and while the thick stench of blood had made a few of these ladies swoon at first, they had persevered on. Richard paced from side to side in front of these ladies, memorizing the reactions of each. He then spoke up, "If any of you here can point out Kojo's wife or children, you will immediately be released." The women all kept their calm at first, but the vicious gleam in these thugs' eyes and the blood still dripping from their weapons was a constant reminder of what would happen if they didn't leave this dangerous place immediately. A horrendous wail suddenly resounded throughout the building, striking fear into the hearts of those present. A young woman who was dressed like a peasant immediately jumped up, pointing to one of the ladies and shouting, "It's her! She's Kojo's wife! Plebeian! You will die a death by whipping!" The lady screamed, her voice a mixture of extreme terror and fury. With someone opening it up, the rest of the women followed. Their only fear at that point was that the others would give up a name before they could. "That's Kojo's son. That hag is his mistress." All of Kojo's family had been named within the blink of an eye. He had a main wife, 2 mistresses, a son, and a daughter. In a rare gesture of generosity, Richard waved to the women dressed like peasants, "Very well. You are free to leave." The women trembled as they slowly dragged to the door, but when they realized that there was nobody stopping them, they ran out screaming. "Ola! Bring 2 men with you. Take this esteemed lady for a walk. Please apprise us of the night's collections, my lady." "Your wish is my command, master," Ola answered politely. His extensive background with the wealthy and influential had given him a keen perception that made him the ideal candidate to confiscate Kojo's possessions. "You only have 10 minutes, Richard reminded the excited elf. "If that is the case, it will be necessary to use some slightly unscrupulous methods," Ola replied. "That's up to you," Richard waved him off. Ola took 2 of the knights along with him, pulling the wife and mistresses from their positions as he headed upstairs. Just as expected, the bard managed to clear out Kojo's treasures in the 10 minutes he had been given. Gold, jewels, and precious metals, the total value worth about 5,000 gold coins. That was all expected, however. What Richard hadn't expected was an ornate box with 3 mana crystals the size of a finger within. Those were really useful, they could be used to enchant equipment, or create potions. The crystals could also be used to power a magic formation as well. These crystals looked and were structured the same as the ones Richard was used to, indicating that mana worked pretty much the same way in this plane as in Norland. It also implied that there was a vein somewhere here, something that was great news to a mage like him. The expressions of the 3 women were quite unnatural, especially of the prettiest of Kojo's mistresses. It was obvious that Ola had cast his charms on them, and the effects were more than desirable. Richard took note of the time, immediately giving the men their next missions. He stuffed the women and children into 2 horse carriages, ordering someone to escort them back to the base. At the same time, the 5 defectors led 20 men who'd surrendered to ambush the reinforcements from the training camp. Richard cast a glance at the arrow tower of the manor before setting off, ordering it lit up in flames. Smoke shot up into the sky as the building became an enormous torch, visible more than 10 kilometers away. This was a hint that the invaders had already retreated, also preventing the reinforcements from Hoven or elsewhere from running in the wrong direction. The defectors had provided the ambush site, and they succeeded in catching more than 10 cavalry and 20 infantry from the training camp. A wave of soldiers rushed forth under Richard's command, comprised of the newly surrendered soldiers who'd been armed with weapons. The trolls were right behind along with Richard's knights, while the 3 raptors stealthily flanked to the enemy's rear, ready to attack. These reinforcements didn't have powerful knights like Kojo's original army, and they were crushed almost immediately. Richard didn't even get a chance to use magic. They just cleaned up casually, before moving on to the next point of ambush. These were the guards from Hoven. This ambush was slightly more difficult than the previous one. Aside from the guards, there were more than 10 adventurers as well. An old level 5 mage had actually showcased his power, launching a fireball at the army. However, that had also made him a target for execution, and Ola had sent an arrow punching through his chest in a matter of moments. Still, they'd only lost 2 of the defecting soldiers and had 3 more gravely injured by the time the enemies were annihilated, all due to that old mage's spell. However, with Flosan's healing magic, the injured would only need to rest for 10 days before they could enter the battlefield once more. The very fact that they'd been healed greatly boosted the morale of the surrendered soldiers. 1 attack and 2 ambushes had completely destroyed all remnants of Kojo's power. At least for that night his fief was like a young lady with her clothes ripped off, about to be raped and pillaged at will. Even outside of the treasure, Richard had gotten more than 30 new soldiers. They'd gotten armor from the training camp, along with more than 20 warhorses that allowed Richard to form his own cavalry. They moved on Hoven at dawn. The trolls and the raptors had been left behind, in case they scared the citizens. Enemy attack. Lord, it's the devils from another plane. Quick! Get help! Amidst the tense, chaotic screaming and warning alarms were a few tragic wails, fragmented and dispersed. Any guard that rushed towards Richard's contingent was hacked to death in seconds. His knights were well-rounded soldiers, able to fight on horseback or on foot. Eventually, nobody outside of a few rash idiots came forward anymore. All the buildings shut their windows tightly, and the people hid behind their doors with bated breath. Richard moved along on his warhorse, gradually coming up to an empty square in the middle of the small town. He asked indifferently, "Where is your mayor?" He hadn't been loud, but with the utter silence in that moment his words had traveled far. A 2-storied building opened after a moment, the wizened mayor shuffling out from within. He stood in front of Richard's horse, mustering all his courage to ask, "I am Hoven's mayor, my lord. Might I ask what brings you here, and what you require? I will try my best to satisfy your needs, but I have one tiny request, please stop the massacre." The townspeople had quietly followed the mayor's lead, gathering in the empty square. A few corpses were still strewn on the ground, the blood barely coagulated as its stench wafted out with the morning wind. Richard glanced at the gathered crowd. "Anyone who dares touch my men will be killed immediately. I will brook no discussion. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc. please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 2, Chapter 30. Tax. "Most of our guards have perished," the mayor exclaimed with a pained expression on his face. "As for those who have not, I see that many have joined you. There isn't anyone else here who would dare put up any resistance." "I would hope so," Richard said as he waved his hand in front of him. "We may come from a different plane, but we aren't some demons who seek to destroy and slaughter. Do not be fooled by your puny god of valor. We have our own god backing us, and he is far more powerful." Flosan. Flosan moved forward upon hearing her name, flipping open the Book of Time as she cast a blessing on the old mayor. The man panicked as everyone saw a blinding flash fall upon him, but that light gave off a warm glow. Despite carrying with it the vicissitudes of time, it held a strong aura of life and death, clearly displaying the power of a true god, not something dark and evil. Blessings were an elementary divine spell, but at their core they were unlike any other. They were bright and potent for their level, their effects simply mind-blowing. Seeing one in front of their very eyes, the townspeople went into an uproar. Richard took advantage of the situation, loudly proclaiming, "We are here upon the true God's directions, to spread his glory. Hoven shall henceforth be my territory, and I, Richard Archaron, shall be your leader. All property that once belonged to Sir Kojo or Baron Forza is now under my charge." The announcement brought great relief to the villagers. Wars between aristocrats were normal, but most of them had lived in Hoven for generations and only a few had migrated from elsewhere. Life went on regardless of who the ruler was, the only change being the amount of tax they paid. However, the past few skirmishes from Richard's army had caused great casualties. Many soldiers had died at their hands, and the families of the dead militia despised him right now. Such hatred could not be quelled easily, but that was something Richard was well aware of. He was not going to ease their resentment of him, instead ruling with the power of fear. The mayor asked a crucial question, "Lord Richard, are you planning to take over this territory permanently?" Richard glared at the mayor and loudly proclaimed, "Indeed. However, I am required at another battlefield right now, and I will be leaving soon. You shall make your decision by then, but I hope you will not let me down when I return. For now, though, pay me all the tax that you owe Kojo." The mayor frowned, about to reason that it wasn't time yet to hand over their taxes. However, a loud protest suddenly rang out from the townspeople behind him. "You demons from another plane, get out of our world!" A young teenager shrieked, brandishing a dagger he'd carefully concealed as he made a mad dash for Richard. "Son, come back!" A middle-aged warrior rushed after him. The man was tan, his muscular physique indicating that he was full of strength and vigor. However, he was too slow to stop the teen. "For the god of valor!" the boy shouted, rushing towards Richard. However, he seemed to lose all control of his body mid-charge, falling to the ground. The boy twitched a few times, but soon stopped moving completely. A tiny wound appeared on the portion of his back behind his heart, and blood started seeping out. His clothes were dyed red. Waterflower remained in place, seemingly never having moved. It was unknown when the shepherd of eternal rest had been unsheathed, but a drop of fresh blood dripped off the tip of the blade. However, its sharp edge still seemed newly polished, without a trace of the attack remaining. "Son, I will avenge you." The warrior charged forth as well, his eyes bloodshot as he bared his sizable fists at Richard. However, the young lady seemed to move slightly once more, another drop of blood appearing on her blade. The man managed to take 2 more steps, before falling headfirst at the mayor's feet. His blood rapidly soaked the old man's shoes. Richard barely seemed to notice the 2 casualties, speaking coldly to the mayor, "Do you see this? I never issue empty threats, and there is a limit to my patience and respect. I'm just following aristocratic tradition. Now, if you still wish to resist my rule, then you are my enemies. That is, you are forcing me to become a demon. Demons do not need followers." "I understand, my lord. Please give me some time, I will hand over the taxes we were supposed to pay the next season." The mayor had spoken with a pained expression of resignation on his face, and he slowly retreated to his humble residence. Richard's tax from Hoven was 100 gold coins, 2 full hides from slain beasts, as well as 2 boxes of books. That was all the literature available in the town, used in place of 300 coins. The mayor believed the books to be worth a tiny fraction of the amount Richard had waived for them, however, something that gave him some consolation. 30 defected soldiers followed behind Richard as he left. During the entire time they were here, these 30 had been the target of even more attention than Richard himself. Almost all the soldiers were close to or at least knew someone from Hoven. After all, the land was only so large and the leaders had formed intricate bonds. The defectors had blood on their hands, but they didn't have any option but to continue fighting for Richard. Unlike those who dared stand against him, they did not have the will to fight the mage. They had seen the trolls and raptors, and knew that resistance would be futile. It wasn't until noon the next day that the Baron's reinforcements arrived. There were several hundred of them, their scale far exceeding Menta's army, but there were only 3 novice knights and a handful of veterans past level 5 amongst their ranks. Even if they had strength in numbers, Menta's smaller army was actually better than them in terms of capability. That was why they had barely managed to cover 20 kilometers in a day. The Baron had sent half his army over. Logically speaking, they should have been led by a titled knight, but with Kojo missing and Menta and Hubert confirmed dead, the other 2 titled knights had suddenly fallen gravely ill as well. Forza was already 50 years old, and at level 8 he would only be more powerful cannon fodder in the army. It was unlikely that he would lead the troops personally. Thus, these 3 novices who had often offended people had been pushed into leadership. The army only made its way into the town once their scouts confirmed multiple times that the invaders had left. They'd come with a renewed ambition to take over, and the knights were outraged when they learned what Richard had done. They felt like the mayor and townsfolk had colluded with the invaders, using torture, arrests, and threats of violence to have them pay twice what they'd given Richard to prove their loyalty to the Baron. And unlike Richard, it went without saying that they wouldn't accept books and waive the taxes owed. If they didn't have powerful family or friends to back them up, the wealthier citizens had everything taken from them. At the same time, all the adventurers who had stayed on in Hoven had been arrested. The dozen of them were marked as accomplices of Richard, and they would serve as the army's accomplishment on this deployment. There was some fighting and death in the process, but the sheer size of the army managed to detain most of them, bar a few who managed to get away. The adventurers were of unknown origin to the three knights, and since they weren't citizens, their deaths did not matter. They would be the best display of the army's might. Who was to say that they weren't the invaders' guides? As for Hoven, it was a fief with its lord gone. Kojo's family had been taken away by the invaders as well, and finding a suitable heir from his bloodline would be a long and arduous process. The Baron himself could find some reasons to take the land over. This left the town without a master, with anyone able to come and pillage it without repercussion. The lion's share of these taxes would go to these knights and their subordinates, with the remainder heading to the Baron. Having been heavily plundered, the citizens of Hoven wondered how they would pass the cold, hard winter. Their main income was from adventurers, the military, tourists, and merchants. After this storm, no adventurers would dare to come to this barony anytime soon. However, that was of no concern to the knights. Why would they care about the lives of people not under their charge? That was Kojo's responsibility. Things were exactly as Richard had envisioned them. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 31. Reputation. Unlike Hoven, which had been plundered twice, Asfa had turned out to be much more fortunate. This tiny town that was closest to the mountains and the invaders' base hadn't been visited at all. Hoven's luck had been terrible both times, and in varying ways. However, Richard had gotten most of his gains from Kojo's estate and the training camp, with the tax he collected from the town itself being minimal. On the other hand, all of the money the Baron's army collected had come from the town. At this point, it was difficult to tell who the town hated more. It was Richard's intention to bypass Asfa. He pondered over things deeply, simulating the situation on the map countless times over before he decided to let off the closest, most probable supply point. He'd instead decided to lay his hands on the heart of Kojo's territory at Hoven, and as expected they'd won in a single battle and achieved many of their fundamental goals. From another point of view, not touching Asfa gave his enemies the misconception that they'd long since left their base, choosing another one instead. If they hadn't, there would be no reason to avoid removing the thorn in front of their eyes. Richard's army took advantage of the night, heading towards the mountains. They would reach the foot of the range by dawn, and with only a single village along their route, it would be easy to hide their tracks. Of course, the ones leading the way were the defected troops who were familiar with the terrain. By the time dawn broke, the group was already 30 kilometers from Hoven, having traveled through a small forest to arrive at a lake at the foot of a mountain. They would reorganize themselves here, setting up camp. Richard's next plans were vague and incomplete for now, and would have to wait until he got news from Marvin. The lake wasn't very large, but the water was clear. Its serene surface made it reflective, like one side of a polished sapphire. A few streams flowed into the lake from a short distance away, and at the banks it was like a patch of grassland. The war horses had been loosened up, with the experienced soldiers bringing them to drink water and eat the grass. 2 carriages were parked by the lake. This was the furthest they could travel, for further ahead was the precarious mountain path that even horses would have trouble moving through. When the women and children who had suffered through the night alighted from the carriages, they all looked pale and unsteady, unable to remain on their feet. A few of the young, pretty ladies looked ready to faint any time, but when they realized that the ones who'd come to support them were two terrifying trolls, they immediately shrieked, growing more alert and alive than anyone else. Trolls were a powerful, intelligent race that also existed on this plane. They were famous for eating humans, be they male, female, young, or old. The captives had erupted into chaotic screaming, and were gathered up and forced to sit as they waited for the defected troops to build the camp. Medium Rare was off helping these new soldiers cut trees, while Tiramisu set up a huge wok in preparation to cook his best meat stew. Richard found a shady spot and spread out his map on the grass, continuing to analyze their current situation and environment. However, a message suddenly radiated in his mind, the broodmother's voice ringing out, "Master, I've discovered a camp of goblins. There are about 200 of them, and I am preparing to clear it out." "All right," Richard answered, "be safe." Goblins were weak individually, about equal to a level 1 or 2 human on average. Even their most powerful were level 5 at best, but their strength lay in their fast breeding and adaptability to many environments. They were present on a lot of planes, but their existence here only meant this plane was even more similar to Norland. A camp of 200 was considered small for the race, and these creatures were by nature the kind to disperse when they met a powerful opponent, unable to form an effective counterattack. Thus, Richard wasn't really worried about the broodmother's safety. It was a new day, and it already had 3 more enhanced raptors at its side, ensuring its chances of victory were even higher. However, the goblins and Richard's own observation of the surroundings over the past few days told him that this plane was far more abundant in food than even Norland itself, making the races more diverse as well. He picked up a pictorial bestiary from amongst the books he'd received from Hoven, beginning to flip through it. These books to him were more important than thousands of gold. They would give him a better understanding of this plane, thus increasing his survivability. But despite his confidence in the broodmother, Richard still kept watch over the general situation. His blessing of precision automatically labeled the creature with an image in his mind, a half-full bar next to it that had changed from blue to red. This bar represented the amount of energy the broodmother had in reserve, something that decided the number of drones it could produce. The broodmother was over 30 kilometers away from Richard himself, and it only needed to take care of a little goblin camp. Thus, he didn't have his own raptors go over and help, instead having them disperse into the forest to capture their own food. In the distance, Ola was busy writing a letter to Baron Forza under Flosan's direction. While the Elven bard still didn't have a good grasp of the new language, his understanding of art allowed him to write these completely foreign symbols out beautifully. The content of the letter was simple. It was basically a demand for ransom, in exchange for the wives and children of Sir Kojo. If Baron Forza was willing to pay more for them than a slave trader would, then he could retain his dignity and reputation amongst his subordinates. Richard knew that this letter was fated to come to naught. Even if the Baron was willing to pay the ransom, his own status as an invader from another plane made them fated enemies. There was nothing that could be done about that. The god of valor had sent an oracle down, so trades of any kind with the invaders would be seen as disrespecting the gods. Of course, Nyan wasn't all-knowing, unable to be up to date on everything happening in the world at the same time. In truth, even the master of all gods was only close to being omniscient and omnipotent. Nyan had eyes and ears in this territory through his clerics and priests. And while those eyes and ears could be muted for a while for a certain cost, that price would be far higher than what he lost if he refused to pay the ransom. What Richard needed now was to hurt Forza's reputation. And that wasn't a hard task, given that it wasn't very high in the first place. Within the forest, Waterflower had the Shepherd of Eternal Rest in her hand as she performed the same slashing motion again and again as if she did not know the meaning of fatigue. Gangder was leaning by a large tree not far away, the axe by his side finally satiated with fresh blood. He watched unlazily as a few of the defected soldiers transported the wood he had just chopped to the side of the lake, for use as support for the camp. "These guys work pretty hard," Gangder stated leisurely. "I don't like them," Waterflower answered without enthusiasm. All of a sudden, she performed a horizontal slash, speaking with a hint of bloodlust. "They actually hate us. If they get the chance, they will murder us immediately." Gangder shrugged and answered, "Most of them are cowards and timid trash. Boss definitely knows that. He doesn't need their respect, only enough fear to keep them obedient. The brave ones were already fed to my axe. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 2, Chapter 32. Reputation, 2. At that time, the brood mother was wiggling its heavy body across the forest. It possessed great strength, knocking down every tree in its path as it left a visible trail through the woods. Once the last tree fell with a dew, the goblin camp came into clear view. The camp took up the entirety of a hill, surrounded by a fence of branches that acted as a crude enclosure. It was littered with many crudely built huts, and what made it strange was that there was a cave leading underground in it. Most goblins had grown used to living in caves, only the richest and most powerful of them had the luxury of staying in huts. There were many goblins scurrying in and out of that cave. This wasn't just a camp with 200, it was a full-blown tribe with more than 1,000 residents. The attack began without much hesitation. The countless goblins screamed, brandishing all kinds of weapons as they rushed out of their camp. They went up against 9 huge worker drones that were about 1.5 meters long, with great offensive abilities alongside paralytic poison and razor-sharp blades. The workers killed a goblin with every movement they made, but alas, the goblins won out in numbers. One of the workers was a split second too slow to react, downed by a couple of goblins in an ambush. After that, 10 more rushed over to it and buried it alive. The brood mother could feel its life being drained away in its consciousness. A low-pitched rumble sounded in the forest as 3 ferocious raptors charged towards the goblins. This time, it was a bloodbath. These were attack drones, specialized for combat, unlike the workers who were meant to gather food. Their bladed front limbs could effortlessly cut a goblin apart, and coupled with their enhanced strength they could effortlessly dismember a few goblins in a strike. The raptors also possessed another deadly trait, their abnormally large mouths. Their mouths were capable of ripping the strongest goblin into pieces without breaking a sweat. The raptors had strong bodies, and were also very agile. The most these goblins could do was leave some superficial cuts, not doing much damage at all. Some of their attacks just missed with the sheer speed of the raptors. With the raptors added into the fray, the goblin tribe suffered many casualties. What made things worse was the silhouette of the brood mother outside their camp. It was the last straw, shattering any confidence they had left, even though they had lost just over 200 soldiers so far. The goblins began to disperse in all directions, running into the forest where the sluggish brood mother could not catch up. All it could do was send out orders to the raptors and workers, having them split up and give chase. While goblins were weak at fighting, they were fast little creatures. With the limited number of raptors and worker drones, and having maintained a safe distance from the brood mother, they only suffered 100 more casualties. This hunt had drawn to a close. The brood mother continued its journey into the camp, paying no mind to all the food on the floor. It felt a very alluring presence from this goblin camp, an indescribable wave of spiritual power beckoning to it. The fences guarding the camp may as well have been withered twigs. The broodmother passed over them with ease, making its way to the center of the camp to stop at a stone which looked like an altar. This 2-meter altar was the source of that inexplicable attraction to the goblins. It would be considered a magnificent structure. There was a stone statue erected on the altar, a depiction of a fully armored gnome carrying a gigantic axe with both its hands. It was carved intricately, seeming very lifelike, completely unlike the normal crude and messy sculptures of the goblins. It cut an imposing figure, exuding a faint aura of death. Goblins could not possibly produce such an exquisite piece of art, but here it was. Ancestral worship. This statue was an idol of a goblin ancestor that this tribe worshipped, and also the thing that greatly attracted the brood mother. Nobody would have thought that goblins would practice such a thing. The cracks and erosion on the statue suggested that it had suffered the wrath of nature for a long time, and was at least a few hundred years old. The goblins had worshipped it for that entire length of time, which was the reason it had manifested godlike powers. And those godlike powers were exactly what called out to the broodmother. The broodmother propped itself up, opening its large mouth as wide as it could before it swallowed the statue with one big gulp. It didn't just stop there, however. It instead used the pincers on its mouth to cut the altar apart, the stone crumbling as though it was freshly baked bread. It then lazily picked up the fragments, swallowing them as well. Even if it wasn't as much as with the statue, this altar possessed some faint divine power as well. It would not let anything go to waste. Even as the broodmother quickly began digesting the statue, a sudden, blazing pain struck its body. This was the result of the divine powers being decomposed and absorbed. "Broodmother, are you all right?" Richard's voice came immediately in its consciousness. He had felt its pain, and was voicing his concern. "I'm fine, Master. I found an altar for ancestral worship at the goblin camp. It was just what I was looking for, a source of extraordinary energy. It can vastly improve my abilities, so I ate the whole altar. I just need some time. Digesting such great power is challenging and painful." "An altar for ancestral worship? You can absorb divine power?" Richard was extremely surprised. "Is this power divine?" "I don't feel like it is as vast and esoteric as true divine power. I'm completely unable to absorb Miss Flosan's powers at all." Richard let out a laugh. "Flosan possesses the power of the eternal dragon, and even powerful gods cannot match up to its powers. There may be greater powers in the countless planes, but we know nothing as of now. Anyway, what powers did you gain from the altar?" "I haven't fully absorbed its powers yet. For now, it just gives me more energy capacity," the broodmother replied. Richard could also feel the energy bar of the broodmother expand in his mind, increasing steadily until it was a little more than a third larger than before. This meant that, if fed adequately, the broodmother could now maintain up to 12 raptors. He also felt a hazy spot of light deep within the broodmother's body, but he couldn't discern what it was. Once it had consumed the altar, the broodmother started on the rest of its meal. Its energy slowly increased. At a riverside, about 10 kilometers away from the barony's capital, was a scenic little town. This was Sir Kokat's territory, known for its optimal location and plenty of local specialties. The mackerel from the river was fresh and delicious, a favorite amongst the dinner tables of nobility. With the wealth of his lands, Kokat had even managed to build a small castle. The exterior was classical, with high walls and narrow windows. The interior, however, was extremely beautiful and extravagant. The rooms were also decorated tastefully, with style and comfort in mind. This was a palace, not meant for battle. The upper section of the castle also broke off from tradition. A semicircular balcony was suspended over the top, allowing the owner to admire the scenery in his spare time. This was well in line with the knight's style. He loved using gold and politics to deal with his enemies, not violence. However, in the hall he loved the most, Sir Kokat was currently as angry as a lion. He paced back and forth relentlessly, but that did little to quell the rage in his heart. He swung out with his hand, sending an intricate vase flying to the wall where it shattered to pieces. The butler was startled upon hearing the broken vase, starting to tremble in fear without the courage to knock and ask if everything was all right. He tiptoed away, distancing himself from the door so he wouldn't hear something he wasn't supposed to. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 33. Seeking help. All invaders are demons. And even if they aren't, they will be dealt with like they are. Anyone who associates with them will be treated like their allies, tied up at the church and burnt at the stake. You? How could you do such a thing? Kokat raged, his voice deliberately low in fear of being overheard. Marvin was sitting comfortably on the sofa opposite him, sipping on fragrant black tea. He waited for Kokat's anger to subside a little before saying, "Father, I'm already working with these demons. Come, have a look." He reached out his hand as he spoke, and a crimson flame suddenly appeared upon it. The flame was as dark as centuries-old blood. Although the flame didn't last long, it still drained enough mana to leave Marvin pale, having him gasp for air. Kokat was overwhelmed with shock. He took in a sharp breath, exclaiming, "Dark flame! You've become a fallen priest?" "I'm only level 6, so I don't qualify to be called a full priest yet." "For now, I'm a fallen cleric," Marvin corrected his father calmly. "Who is the new god you've started to worship?" the knight asked frantically, his gaze unwavering. "The eternal dragon," Marvin replied before adding, "It isn't a god from our plane." An unreadable expression overtook Kokat's face, and he took a while to speak again. "This eternal dragon definitely has to be a powerful force, if it can channel its energy across planes." Marvin poured himself another cup of tea. "My dear father, I'm sure you understand now that I'm bound to the demons henceforth, unable to separate myself from their camp. As for you, if it's discovered that you're the father of a fallen cleric, you will be burnt at the stake as well. Instead of this anger, wouldn't it be better for you to think of a way to get me out of this? These invaders evidently aren't as weak as the priests made them out to be. Even though they're young, 20 years of age at most, they have astonishing power. Think about this, a number of level 10 invaders, despite being ill-equipped, managed to completely annihilate an army led by Sir Menta and Sir Hubert. That's 2 of the Baron's titled knights." Sir Kokat groaned heavily, not saying a word. Marvin was his son, he naturally couldn't lie. These intruders were clearly of high status in their own plane, and likely had great powers backing them. Kokat paced up and down the hall relentlessly, eventually reaching a conclusion. "The direwolf Duke might be able to help you solve the problem. His clan worships their ancestors, and is at odds with the god of valor. I'll write you a letter of recommendation that you can bring to Baron Fontaine, the Duke's brother. He will be able to introduce you to the Duke. But," he paused and looked at Marvin with concern, "the direwolf Duke is notorious for his tyranny. You must be careful when dealing with him. If his mood grows bad, he might tear you to shreds. Also, here's the map of Baron Forza's castle you wanted. I can only help you so much. When you leave, take extra precaution not to let others recognize you." Marvin took the letter of recommendation from his father, carefully stowing the thick scroll away. He then bowed deeply. "Father, I have a premonition that you won't regret your decision today." Kokat could only let out a snort to that, not knowing what to say. Even level 6 wasn't much of a deal given his son's age, and divination and prophecy were arts that could only be performed by true priests at level 12 and above. Such priests also had to have great favor from their lord to be able to adequately perform such spells. All this talk of premonitions was just nonsense. Around the same time, a vase more valuable than any of Kokat's possessions hit the wall in Baron Forza's study, shattering into a million pieces on the floor. The Baron was evidently dejected. Even after wrecking the vase, he pounded his table without end until he was left huffing and puffing. His butler had been hiding in a corner throughout this tantrum. "My lord," he finally managed once Forza's rage faded, "Priest Eshin has been waiting on you for the past half hour." Forza grunted heavily, trying to fix his disheveled hair as he slowly followed the butler to the hall. Eshin was a priest who was already at level 12, and was the person who had coordinated his territory's rise in the divine ranks. Even in secular influence, the man wasn't far off from Forza himself, and with the Baron's army taking a significant blow that especially reduced his elite's fighting strength by more than half, the priest's own army of about 30 paladins had become a formidable force in the region. Baron Forza had an alarmingly thin frame, and a head of white hair. Late nights for many days had left him with an ashen complexion, and with deep bags under his eyes. Upon entering the hall, the Baron saw Eshin admiring an oil painting of the goddess of spring. He addressed the man, "Priest Eshin, if you are here to ask for help with the invaders, I'm afraid there isn't much for us to talk about." Eshin managed to smile, seemingly unbothered by the Baron's cold demeanor. My lord, he responded, I indeed am here to discuss that very matter. You know the oracle. Don't talk to me about the oracle. Forza raised his voice. Only you know what it contains. If the intruders were as weak and insignificant as you made them out to be, and fewer than 20 in number, how is it that the last 3 nights and the hundreds of elite troops I sent out were all defeated by them? Startled, Eshin replied, the oracle is never wrong. As a priest who serves the god of valor, that is something I could never lie about. There is only one reason for the way the battles turned out. If I were to put it bluntly, my lord, you should train your troops properly. Forza grunted, looking uncomfortable, but he didn't say a word. Eshin was criticizing him for powerless leadership, but when he'd received the battle report he himself could only conclude the same thing. But he was helpless now. The remaining 2 knights weren't good at military matters, having been given their position due to social connections and blood ties. It wouldn't be very useful to send them out to battle. My lord, you are in quite the plight at the moment. My humble suggestion is that you promptly seek the assistance of Earl Jalion. If you send a messenger now, he should be able to reach the Earl's castle within 3 days. We might still be able to catch the invaders. You might be losing some money and reputation, but that is much better than the incident at Hoven occurring once more. But Forza replied coldly, even if the Earl accedes to my request, his troops will need at least 10 days to get here. What will the church do until then? I have already sent out a messenger to ask for help from the bigger church in the duchy. Eshin's reply stunned Forza for a moment. Turning to a bigger authority for help meant that Eshin conceded to not being able to handle the matters of his region by himself, which would make it even more difficult for him to be promoted or to be given divine grace. While he felt that Eshin's decision was a little peculiar as it would put himself in a disadvantaged situation, it made Forza feel a little more at ease. He called upon his personal attendant to write a letter on the spot, and gave orders for this letter to be delivered to the Earl within 3 days. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 34. Agreement. By nightfall, the camp at the lakeside had fallen silent. Both the soldiers and their captives were thoroughly exhausted after the long, hard day, and they'd gone to bed early. The only ones full of energy were the 3 raptors, who'd just had a heavy meal. They took on patrol duty. Richard meditated until he completely recovered his mana, before walking out of his tent and slowly wandering towards the lake. Standing by the lake was the graceful silhouette of Flozan. Even though she rarely meditated, it seemed like she could recover her mana just as fast as him. She was quietly gazing out at the lake, her thoughts a mystery. The Book of Time was hanging from her waist, glowing faintly that when coupled with the misty haze from the lake made her seem dreamy. Richard walked over and casually asked, "What's on your mind?" "You and I." Her slightly hoarse voice was as lethal as ever. Richard stopped, coughing a few times in an attempt to hide his awkwardness. Flozan had an extraordinary charm, great enough to make him feel awkward with that dubious answer. He'd retreated a few times before, but this time he wouldn't back off from the exchange. He clarified, "What about us, Our relationship." Richard gritted his teeth and continued, "What relationship?" However, he realized how stupid that sounded the moment the words left his mouth. This evidently surmounted to a type of defeat. Flozan turned around, gazing deep into Richard's eyes. "I've been thinking of how many years we can keep this up." Her reply was really vague, and seemed to conceal another meaning. However, it was also possible that she meant nothing at all. Richard sighed, "Many. As long as we can survive." She let out a faint smile, "We will as long as you want us to." This made Richard curious. "You seem to be more confident in me than I am in myself." "You have a strange ability. The depths of the battlefield seem transparent to your gaze. What's more, you also have your brood mother." She deliberately paused for a while before continuing, "And you have me." Everything she had said was correct. However, some of it was especially lethal. Looking at the priestess under the moonlight, Richard couldn't help but think back to her body. It took a difficult struggle for him to control his desires, and he spoke sternly, "You've seen the information on our surroundings. The commoners aren't necessarily hostile to us, we might even have an opportunity to work with the nobles. The only ones who truly want to destroy us here are the deities." Flozin replied, "That goes without saying. Our presence here already violates the law of the plains, they will definitely try to get rid of us. However, even if you conquer the entire plain, the nobles will still find a place in your regime." Richard nodded in agreement, so we actually have a high possibility of finding good allies. There are two candidates. First is the direwolf duke in the west, who comes from a clan that believes in ancestral worship. And the other is Earl Oliver in the south. Rumors say he's dabbled in the dark arts for almost 20 years, and he has numerous connections to the abyss. I've heard that he's secretly created a pool of blood, frequently killing his prisoners to present them as offerings. It indicates that he's trying to summon demons, and they definitely won't be from this plane, so they won't be in the same camp as the god of valor. Most interestingly, neither territory is particularly far away, but they've still continued their existence. This means that they have enough capability that the church cannot just destroy them. Indeed. A violent tyrant and a murderous maniac, Flozin hit the nail on the head. Richard nodded, "We have no choice but to work with murderers and tyrants now. Watch out for them. They may eat you alive." Richard laughed, "They can try. They'll most likely break their teeth." The two continued to joke around for a while, something that finally allowed Richard to grow less tense. He gazed at the calm lake, saying, I feel like it takes more time for me to increase my mana pool here." That is normal. The greater the restrictions on power in a plane, the slower one grows as well. Primary planes don't have many restrictions on power, which is the entire reason they've grown to their positions. To a certain extent, expeditions to lesser planes are a waste of your lifespan, exchanging time for resources. If your only ambition is power, you need to remain in your primary plane to hone your craft. Oh. And before I forget, this plane only has 2 moons. Why can I still draw the powers of the 7 moons when I use the secret swords? Flozin shook her head, "That I don't know. There are far too many mysteries in the plains, and my knowledge barely scratches the surface. The only things I know are from written accounts." Richard let out a long sigh, "All right, I understand now. I've had a few ideas recently, and a breakthrough in my research into fireballs. Fireballs again. That spell is only good when you need to roast a pig." Flozin couldn't help but let out a laugh that faded into a tight-lipped smile. Shrouded in the moonlight reflecting off the lake, she looked indescribably beautiful. "No, there's always room for improvement. I can now delay the spell by up to a second. If I launch 3 fireballs in a triangular formation, I should be able to delay them such that they explode together." Richard immediately squatted down, scribbling on the ground by the lake. Flozin didn't think anything of it at first, but after some deeper consideration her complexion rapidly changed. If Richard really could control the spell so well, then the target in the center of that triangle wouldn't just be a roasted pig. She hadn't heard of anyone under the level of great mages who had such great control over their magic. Richard continued rambling, but then he suddenly looked up to gaze at the distance. He then gasped in surprise. "What is it?" Flozin asked. "It's nothing, let us continue." The broodmother had just informed him that it had discovered a valley inhabited by trogs. It had sealed the mouth off, and was preparing for a meal. Trogs were just like goblins, a community that could barely pass off as an intelligent species. While they weren't as smart as even the goblins, however, their fighting strength was far superior. Richard had grown concerned for the brood mother for a moment, but he quickly dismissed it. It was capable of discerning the threat its prey posed. Richard had just said a few words, before suddenly turning his attention towards the forest. He stood up, frowning. "It's late. Why is Ola running towards the forest? The raptors are taking care of patrolling. Come, let's have a look. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 35. Agreement 2. Flozen nodded, stretching her hand out towards Richard. She pointed first at him and then at herself, divine energy flowing into their bodies that froze the external forces around them. As long as they remained silent, they could now avoid the detection of even the most seasoned of scouts. She then cast a spell that allowed them to blend in with the nature, something akin to what was used by the druids who worshipped the goddess of the forest. Any organism under the effects of this spell would blend into the woods perfectly. Even if they touched the trees and leaves, the result would just sound like the wind or any other natural noise. Flozen had casually displayed something special about herself, but Richard noticed nothing strange. He didn't have experience with the priestesses of the eternal dragon. The two became one with the dark forest, stealthily heading in Ola's direction. With the magical contract in place, the elven bard couldn't hide his position from Richard's mind. He'd been in the same part of the forest for a few minutes now. Richard had felt that was strange at the beginning, but then he had a hunch that something may be happening that made him hesitant about getting any closer. However, Flozen would bump into him whenever he slowed down, her faint breath blowing onto his neck. She would gently push against his back, urging him to go further. The priestess couldn't feel the movements of the elf. As they closed in on the foot of a hill, the night wind was really strong. The wind whistled loudly past the forest, covering any other noise. However, Richard felt like the atmosphere had changed, growing increasingly ambiguous. The physical contact with Flozen was growing ever more distinct, and thoughts of her body started to appear in his mind. He tried controlling himself, but it was to no avail. The elven bard didn't venture quite far into the forest, so the two managed to catch up very quickly. There were a few other strange sounds apart from the wind now, the voices of Ola and someone else. Richard slowly lowered the dense bush and branches in front of him, looking ahead. 10 meters away, the elf was holding tightly onto a woman as he fiercely rammed into her body again and again. At the same time, he was using his melodious voice to whisper sweet nothings into her ear. The woman had her back against a tree, her arms wrapped around the bard's neck while her legs held tightly to his waist. Outside of what the tree supported, all of her weight was on Ola. She was in pure ecstasy, each moan louder than the last. The elf reminded her to keep her volume down, so she buried her head into his collar and proceeded to bite his shoulder. Muffled noises escaped her throat, making it seem like she was crying and in great pleasure at the same time. This aroused the elf further, and his thrusts increased in intensity until the woman's body began to spasm violently. Under the night sky, her dazzling white legs repeatedly coiled and twisted. Damn! Richard cursed softly. He would never have expected to see such a thing. If this were any other day, he would not have minded admiring such sights for a while, but now that Flozen was behind him, how would he have the cheek to watch on? Flozen's presence wouldn't let him watch on in peace, and he was starting to feel some uncontrollable reactions. The worst thing was that Flozen put her entire weight onto his back, leaning over his shoulders just enough to watch the frantic display. Ola and the Knight's Mistress. What are they doing? Oh, I understand now. The hoarse voice sounding next to his ear made it even harder for Richard to control himself, and he was on the verge of crumbling. The elf continued its battle with the woman's flesh with a rigorous degree that was unimaginable. It appeared that his strength vastly exceeded its handsome exterior. Richard had had enough. He could no longer fight against both his sexual urges and what was happening in front of him, so he got ready to stand up and shout for the elf to stop. It would be easy enough to find a reason for that liberties couldn't be taken with the prisoners, at least not by the elf. Flozen seemed to have sensed what Richard was about to do, so she used her weight to pin him down, saying gently, "Don't move. Let us continue to watch. I've never seen something like this before." Richard couldn't control his urges any longer, his manhood reaching its limit. He turned his hand over with an angry cry, grabbing Flosan's breasts and groping them hard. In response, the priestess only grunted out an affirmative. The elfin women were gyrating vigorously, reaching orgasm. However, they seemed to stay there for an especially long time. It looked like the bard wasn't just naturally gifted, he'd gone through rigorous special training to be so effective in combat. In this amorous moment, Richard felt especially exhausted instead. It took a long time for the bard to stop, and by then the woman had grown limp as mud, softly hanging onto him. They quickly put their clothes on, leaving in a hurry. Ola continued his sweet nothings along the way, making promises in his sing-song voice. Whether he would make good on them was anyone's guess. Richard and Flosan remained in position, not moving an inch. The bard was done with play, and he'd returned to reality. He was a good scout, and it would be awkward if they were discovered. Since Richard hadn't stepped out to stop them earlier, it would be even more inappropriate to be found out now. Once Ola had left, there was a renewed calm in the forest. Richard suddenly grabbed Flosan and pinned her to the ground, grabbing her robes at the collar and pulling them down to her waist in one forceful motion. This exposed her amber nipples, further enhancing Richard's lust. Flosan looked at the youth who was grinding his teeth, gently squeezing his arm as she whispered, "Ravage me, and there is no turning back. Think before you act." What is that supposed to mean? Are you telling me that the priestesses of the eternal dragon need to remain pure? Richard asked. The small, cold hand rested on his own, sending his blood surging violently throughout his body. No, there is no such thing. However, I can tell you confidently that starting a sexual relationship with me is going to be very troublesome, more than you could ever imagine. At the same time, I myself am a very troublesome person as well, if you treat me as just a woman. But treat me as a priestess, a reliable companion, and you will not be disappointed or burdened. On the contrary, I can help you solve a lot of issues. Flosan rarely spoke this much. Richard seemed undeterred by her speech, ripping her robes off completely to show her naked legs. He then positioned himself before speaking, "You're clearly trying to provoke me. I'm not someone who fears trouble, and if I want to prove that my only option here is to eat you up. I don't know if we'll ever make it back to Norland, so there is no need for me to consider issues of the future." Flosan gently said, "We may die tomorrow anyway, so let's just have some fun before we do? Is that it? You can drop the gentlemanly act now." Flosan's words were like a cold shower over his head. Richard had been prepared to begin, but he ended up holding for a full minute as he thought over it. He suddenly seemed to understand something, exclaiming, "I will survive, and I will bring you all back to Norland. One night before we head back, I'll eat you up." Flosan smiled faintly, speaking in a gentle voice, "All right, then. I will resist when that time comes." This sentence caused Richard to tremble, and he almost couldn't stop himself from penetrating her body. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 36. Reprisal. Richard was full of fresh energy as he walked out of the forest with Flosan, no longer feeling like this plain was perpetually shrouded in gray. He thought back deeply on his relationship with her, finding that it was full of accidents and mistakes. On the eve of returning to Norland. That wasn't just a promise he had made, it was an agreement between the two. However, how was he to get to that step? He kept thinking it over on the road, but couldn't come to a clear conclusion. This was a problem even his gifted intellect couldn't solve, so engaging even the broodmother's messages didn't come to his attention. "I've already captured the trogs. 2/3 of the prey escaped. That was news from 10 minutes ago. I'm having the third batch of raptors continue to follow me, it will increase hunting efficiency. That was 5 minutes ago. Found the nest of a white-backed devil bear. 1 minute ago. Lost in his own thoughts, Richard didn't even notice the sheer increase in the broodmother's hunting, and that it was only giving him news of the difficult targets. Perhaps it was just as it had said before, and the mountains really didn't have any natural predators for it to be wary of. Returning to camp, Richard finally ceased his thoughts on what transpired just earlier and put out his manhood. However, it felt extremely uncomfortable and he ended up unable to sleep, instead continuing to study his map. It felt like the twists and turns of the night had expanded his plane of thought, and his eyes began to trace back and forth along a series of small towns on the map. Time passed quietly. Although Richard and Flozen both acted as though nothing had happened, Ola seemed to be aware of something. He didn't engage with Kojo's mistress again, although he still took the opportunity while on shift to give her some extra food. However, Richard pretended not to see that. Noon of the third day, Marvin returned to the lakeside camp. The schematic of Baron Forza's castle came as a surprise to Richard. While the fallen cleric was terrible at the divine, he was not without merit. He was a master of conspiracy and negotiation. After some thinking, Richard decided to take the letter of introduction from Sir Cocat, going to Baron Fontaine to see if he could get in touch with the direwolf Duke. On the fourth day, Gangder brought back the news Richard had been waiting for. Forza refused to pay a ransom for Sir Kojo's family, even publicly executing Richard's messenger. The corpse was hung high up on the entrance to Hoven, with a sign set up prominently next to it. Written on the sign was a warning in crimson blood: anyone who dared collaborate with the demons would suffer the same fate. The news quickly spread through the temporary camp. The captive women and children immediately burst into tears, not stopping until several knights shouted in a bid to silence them. The soldiers had more varying expressions, but most of them were shocked into silence while a few were whispering to their neighbors. The area was filled with an oppressive air of despair. These men had never been fearless, at least not in front of the enemy. Now there was no way to retreat, and faced with the terrifying might of Baron Forza and Earl Jalion, they naturally lost all color in their faces. "What do we do now, boss?" Gangder asked casually, not caring that his voice resonated across the entire camp. "What do we do?" Richard laughed. "What else can we do? Of course we're going to teach Forza a lesson he won't forget. And on the way, we'll find more distinguished and beautiful ladies to take as companions." Richard immediately started assigning roles, leaving only 2 knights and 10 soldiers to guard the captives. Everyone else left the camp, their first destination being Hoven, with the veteran yeoman leading the way. The forces were strangely silent as they marched along, everyone aware of Richard's unusual determination and bloodlust. However, anyone who knew Richard as a person would know he wasn't angry for that one soldier's death. He'd already estimated that anyway. Thus came the question: how had this change come about? That question was near impossible to answer. Following the troops were 9 raptors. Seeing these savage beasts move silently caused even Gangder to tense up unnaturally, the only ones unaffected being Flozen and Waterflower. Flozen knew the origins of the broodmother, while Waterflower sensed no hostility from these creatures. 9 in the evening was a time when most people in remote villages went to sleep. Hoven's inns were still lively, but the houses had no lights coming from them anymore. These days, even families not in the habit of sleeping early shut their doors and blew out the lights early. The Baron had stationed almost 100 soldiers in Hoven. Although these energetic fighters were helpless against monsters, they were good at oppressing and bullying the townsfolk. The core epithet of this plains government was that people fulfilled their obligations to their lord, while the lord had the responsibility to protect his people. With the lord missing and his family kidnapped, the town was free for the taking. "I hope you will not let me down when I return." When the bloodshed and screaming began once more than one resident of Hoven recalled Richard's words. Those words were still ringing in their ears, but nobody had expected him to return so quickly. However, things were different from his first time here. The people now felt a little relieved, some even overjoyed, except they found it difficult to express. At least they could witness these soldiers receive a proper lesson. Nearly 100 soldiers still posed some amount of threat to Richard's army, even if they were only ordinary warriors without a single knight among them. Even their leader was only level 6, but as an army they were relatively complete. If the infantry and archers could take advantage of the town's defenses, it would cause them some trouble. However, such trivial obstacles never came to be. They weren't prepared to fight, and more than half the soldiers were drunk in the tavern. When Richard rushed in with his men, they weren't even able to escape. It was a massacre. A third of the soldiers were captured, another third killed, while the remainder fled. Richard had anticipated this when he called the attack, having grown more capable now of reading the battlefield. As long as he had enough information, the results wouldn't deviate much from his expectations. However, those who fled were not fortunate. In the dark fields were 9 raptors, and Richard had decided to let only 10 go. They would spread the news everywhere, letting Forza know that he had returned. The so-called battle had ended as soon as it began. Richard's army had struck down 10 men like they were falling leaves, and the rest of them had completely collapsed. Even the 30 deaths total was mostly because a certain few people couldn't restrain their violence, Richard himself being one of the culprits. The first thing he'd done when he rushed into the barracks was to cast a fireball with a 5-second delay. Even though he'd immediately felt that something wasn't right, absorbing the second one before he could cast it, the delayed explosion lit a patrolling squad head-on and lit them aflame. Of course, Gangder and the trolls were savage as well, every swing of their weapons taking the lives of several men. Hoven was occupied once again. Now, none of the townsfolk dared to go out onto the streets, and Richard simply called for someone to take down the corpse of the executed soldier and burn the Baron's signpost. They left quietly with their prisoners, leaving only the dozens of bodies and a strong stench of blood. While the Baron's territory was not small, all major towns were connected by road. Fast horses could reach the capital in under 3 hours, and there were enough escaped soldiers to bring news of his real power to the Baron. However, the commander overseeing the standing army refused to dispatch forces to provide assistance. He insisted on waiting for the Baron's command, or at least for Dawn to send troops. However, Dawn? By then, the demons would have fled far away. The Baron had ordered that he not be disturbed while he slept, since he hadn't rested well recently. Any matters would have to be discussed with the butler, and any intelligent people would know to ignore the light coming from Forza's study room window. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 37. Retribution. While the higher-ups under Forza were searching for a reason to stay put, Richard had already found his way to a different manor. A fireball sent the place's main security, composed of several strong, young soldiers, straight to their graves. He then calmly pointed forth from up on his horse, and a group of soldiers with only shields and swords rushed in. These were the prisoners who'd surrendered earlier in the night, given weapon and shield but no armor to protect them. However, most of the defenders had been swept away by Richard, so the chaotic mob managed to overrun any resistance with sheer numbers. The lord of the manor, an elegantly dressed knight, finally appeared, but he'd spent too much time putting on his full body armor. Gangder and Waterflower saw him as he entered the battlefield imposingly, and a minute later he had been taken prisoner. Half an hour later, Richard moved out with a large number of troops once more. They passed through 2 other manors, capturing the knights that ruled them before finally arriving at their destination at dawn. This was Woodtown, Sir Menta's home. Now, Kojo's wife would have several peers of similar status alongside her. Once they'd captured Woodtown, Richard left the soldiers and captives who were too tired to continue behind. He had 2 mounted knights escort them back to camp, alongside 2 raptors, while he himself took the team from Norland and headed to Sir Hubert's territory of Sequoia Town. A true battle broke out there, with more than 30 guards and warriors from knighted lineages joining the desperate struggle. As valiant as their sacrifices were, however, they were completely in vain. Flosan's presence had rendered them unable to severely wound even a single one of their foes. With Sequoia Town captured, Sir Hubert's family was taken prisoner as well. A total of 28 guards had been slain, shrouding the town in an atmosphere of deep sorrow that won Richard's respect. However, there would be nothing more. Richard left the place at a predetermined time, not delayed in the slightest. The desperate resistance had left them little time for looting. Within a single day Richard had taken out half of the Baron's forces, capturing 3 knights, killing one that refused to surrender, and even making off with 2 of the dead titled knights' wives. If it was just one family, Forza could still feign ignorance. However, with 3 households raided, not doing anything would be the end of his reign. After raging for an entire afternoon, the Baron finally sent out his standing army to pursue the invaders. 500 soldiers left his capital at dusk, led by 5 knights as they rushed to Hoven to attack the invaders who had already moved on. Forza was not a genius, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that the numbers of his men did not make up for their skill. In the meanwhile, the invaders' strength was quite clear. They had at least 15 strong warriors that were more powerful than his knights, and a mage nearing level 10. A damned mage. Mages in this bountiful hinterland were even rarer than priests and shamans. Any mage close to level 10 would be more esteemed than the Baron himself. Such high status did not just come out of their destructive prowess on the battlefield. There were many goods and equipment that only a mage could acquire. Things such as magic equipment and enchantments were very valuable. Because of such prestige, power, and wealth, many wanted to become mages. However, the traditions of this plane placed heavy emphasis on one's lineage, with the requirements on one's ancestry being extremely strict. A mage around level 10 could only accept around 10 apprentices, with no guarantee as to how much these apprentices would be able to learn. Thus, any aristocratic family with the means, even royal families as well, gave any of their children who had the slightest aptitude over to these veterans, filling up that limited quota. Even if some commoners had greater talent, many never had a chance to step foot into that world. Over time, these traditions reinforced the scarcity of mages and made them even more valuable. And the more valuable they became, the more scarce they were. The invaders had a powerful mage on their side. This threat was greater in Forza's eyes than the rest of the invaders combined. There was a saying on this plane: only a mage could deal with a mage. Of course, the one who'd come up with that saying was a mage himself. But his status as a grand mage made this saying unquestionable. While priests, clerics, and powerful warriors could match mages in theory, without many battles to analyze, there weren't many efficient tactics for such confrontations here. The accepted practice was to find a way to exhaust the opponent's mana before they tried to kill him. Forza may have had the funds to build a church to the god of valor, but he couldn't afford a level 10 mage. He'd asked for help from Jalion because the Earl had 3 mages at level 10 or higher. That would be the most traditional of tactics, using a mage to deal with another. Forza was counting the days in his ornate, beautiful study. It would take 5 days at the latest for the Earl's reinforcements to arrive, and if he was lucky the vanguards could make it here in 2. At that moment, he would be safe. However, the cost of such safety caused Forza to shudder. Earl Jalion was infamous for his greed, and surely hadn't passed up the chance to extort a heavy price. Having lost nearly all his fighting forces, Forza had been in no position to bargain. He would lose at least 5 knights' worth. That wasn't just the land, taxes, and manpower. It was also 5 powerful, loyal knights. Had he known such a day would come, Forza would never have provoked these insignificant invaders. The word had a precise definition amongst oracles, indicating that the invaders weren't higher than level 10. However, these very insignificant people could cause losses great enough to threaten him and his knights. Forza regretted the choice to use force. The much wiser option would have been to give them some benefits, and a map that led them to the direwolf Duke. If not that, at the very least the church's paladins should have formed the main force. Forza hadn't had a good night's sleep in a few days. Dark blue eye bags were already hanging from his fleshy face. One could look down on the city harbor from the Baron's study. The lighthouses and the Church of Valor were the most eye-catching buildings in the night, with a magnificent beacon tower taller than even the lighthouses themselves built in the church building. The beacon was lit whenever an oracle was received, or during a festival. The brilliant light would be visible for miles, and would not be extinguished for 10 days. Forza subconsciously gazed up at the magnificent church, and suddenly found the dancing flames blinding. He snorted heavily, pulling his curtains closed to prevent all light from entering his window. His only prayer now was that his army would not encounter the invaders, for he was extremely clear as to what such an encounter would bring about. The vicious intruders could break the morale of these normal warriors with a single flurry of blows. There was an untold reason he had sent his soldiers out at night. Should they scatter, more of them would be able to escape under the cover of darkness. Such was Baron Forza's last military maneuver. The prayer was only partly effective. His men had barely left the barracks, walking only 5 miles when they were discovered by a prowling raptor that immediately sent a telepathic message to Richard, who was far away. A knight had discovered the beast in the long grass, but had taken it to be an unknown monster that had descended from the mountains. He had no interest in hunting at the time, only thinking of swiftly bringing his troops to Hoven and guarding it. The Baron had given him a secret missive before he left, explaining to him that his only task was to safely wait out these last few days before the Earl's reinforcements arrived. The beast seemed reluctant, and tailed the troops from afar for nearly 2 miles before disappearing into the night. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 38. Attack! Forza's army made it all the way to Hoven without incident, making the night leading them feel like the journey was unusually smooth. He didn't know that the raptor fleeing into the night had made Richard well aware of his route, and that the mage had no plans to ambush him. There were more pressing goals than the 500 warriors. At that very moment, Richard was standing at the top of a small hill that overlooked a flourishing city. With a population of over 10,000, it could be called a large city even in Norland. With the fertility of this plain and humans being in a dominant position, the plain had more of an urban population than Norland itself. There were about 500 more soldiers guarding the city, led by a titled knight. However, these soldiers were mostly level 1 or 2, comparable to ordinary men who were blessed with natural strength. He marked the positions the raptor had sent back on a map, making a line that roughly led towards Hoven. Rough calculations told him that the Baron's army would require about 2 hours to reach Hoven. He then turned back to face the people resting in various positions on the hill, proclaiming, "We will rest for another hour. After that, be prepared to strike immediately." Even if the 500 soldiers were quite mediocre, they could still be a threat on their home ground in the heat of battle. Ola whistled, "My lord, please be gentle with any beautiful girls. Try to keep them alive." The elf's words drew a knowing smile from the men in the group, while Flozan and Waterflower remained expressionless as if they'd heard nothing. Richard smiled, ignoring the elf's idle talk. He instead concentrated his mind on giving the raptors orders, having them return from their patrols. This was what had allowed him to know the army's position when they left camp, and by the same link the raptors could find him as well. Already comparable to level 6 warriors, the darkness and chaos would make their bestial senses useful, increasing their effectiveness in the upcoming battle. Half an hour later, all the raptors were back at Richard's side. The broodmother had sent some information back as well. The bears had been destroyed. Richard was startled for a moment. It had 6 raptors assisting it, so taking this long to take out a single nest was questionable. The broodmother alone could take down those equivalent to knights already. However, now was not the time to ponder. It was 10 in the night, the scheduled time to attack. A majority of the people in the port city were already fast asleep, and all the people who were out to make merry were more or less drunk. There wouldn't be more than 50 guards on patrol, with the rest back at camp or at home, resting. Richard waved his hand, and the party began to sneakily advance towards the port. The city had strengthened its defenses given the circumstances, But in Richard's point of view it was still like they had no defenses at all. Medium rare was hidden under a section of the wall, sending the elf and 3 knights over the top. The walls were only 5 meters tall, so the troll could just raise his arms to send a person on top. In fact, Waterflower and Gangder had caught on to the edge in one leap before vaulting over, while Richard just cast a floating spell and made his way directly up the side. 100 meters away, a squad of soldiers was lazily patrolling the city wall. Richard swiftly motioned forward, and Waterflower immediately rushed over with the Shepherd of Eternal Rest in hand. Her bare white feet made no sound against the floor as she disappeared into the shadows like a ghost. The patrolling guards had been focused on the streets, with almost nobody looking at the tall walls. Waterflower had stuck to the walls as she charged across the dozens of meters separating them, and by the time the 2 leading the team looked at her she was already speeding past them. They couldn't even make a sound before her blade had sent 5 heads flying into the sky. Richard's pupils contracted as he looked at the spurt of fresh blood, and the smell of death increased in the air. He took large strides towards the city gates, with Ola, Gangder, and the knights rushing forth before him. But the young lady had already rushed out from another guard tower nearby, stalking another team of guards. The sword softly hissed in the air a few times, and she walked back without incident. Once the few drops of blood fell off the tip of her blade, one would notice nothing but her beautiful, well-defined face. None would realize what she had just done. Gangder begrudgingly slowed down. There was no use of him rushing over when Waterflower had taken care of everything on her own. The big axe in his hand seemed destined not to see action for a while. Ola and the infantry, in the meanwhile, went down the city walls to move the obstacles out of the way before they opened the gates. The trolls brought the warhorses to the city gate, while the raptors followed quietly behind. Richard and the others mounted, facing the wide passage that led to the city that housed the grand church to the god of valor. The first thing someone new to this city would notice was the magnificent church. Atop the church building was a large axe, held by a hand that faced the sky. On top of that was a lighted torch, burning with passion. This was Richard's goal for tonight. The Baron's territory was in its most vulnerable state, and the standing army had all been sent away. Mobilizing them again would require half a day of work, and there were only 4 powerful knights left in the land that were all in Forza's castle. No matter what happened in the port itself, the Baron would likely keep his own safety in mind and not deploy the 2 that were guarding him. And thus, the only resistance Richard would face were 2 knights, Priest Eshin, and 2 more priests around level 8, 30 paladins, less than 100 squires, and a few hundred militia. He'd done his best to disperse the Baron's forces, causing massive casualties in the port. He had to make full use of the destruction. It would be hard to get another such chance in the future. If he continued to put things off, more powerful enemies would converge on him. Looking at the distant church with the nameless sword in his hand, Richard suddenly felt a burning sensation from his chest. This would be his first major assault against a powerful enemy. Attention! Our target this time is the Church of Valor. Let's make quick work of it. Charge. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 39. Attack 2. Richard spurred his horse on, and they picked up their pace as they galloped swiftly towards the church that was a distance away. The fragmented sounds of the hooves hitting the ground resounded throughout the area, causing hearts to race. A man peeked out through the blinds of a house on the road, trying to make sense of the commotion all around him. He gasped in surprise at the sight, immediately covering his mouth when he realized he'd let out a noise. He then shut his windows tightly, slumping to the floor without the ability to stand back up. The ground shook with another rumble, the 2 trolls behind the army charging forward with big strides. There were shadows passing between the buildings on the sides of the road as well, the 9 raptors flanking around from the side quickly. They displayed great agility as they leapt through rooftops and dark alleys. The raptors were different from normal beasts. They had a certain level of intelligence, and Richard could give them some simple commands like have them stay close to each other, roam freely, stop and observe, or attack enemy targets. When the church was less than half a kilometer away, Richard kicked his horse again. The sound of hooves against the ground intensified, like muffled thunder before a storm. Two intoxicated youths stepped out of a brightly lit tavern, dressed in army uniform and looking like they were supposed to be on nightly patrol. They looked out at the streets to see what had disrupted their merrymaking. Seeing the war horses bounding towards him, one of the drunk men uttered in complete shock, "My goodness, what are those?" The other one, a little more sober now, saw the menacing silhouette of the trolls in the distance. "They're the beasts from another plane. God, they've actually managed to enter the city. Hurry, we need to raise the alarm. Quick!" Before he could continue, an arrow from the dark pierced his throat. The remaining words never came out, and even as his swaying partner tried to make sense of the situation, a mounted knight charged over like a gust of wind. He hacked the man's head off with his one-handed axe, sending it flying into the air. The troop continued to gallop past the tavern door, and with the two trolls following them, the guests were completely shaken, quelling any ideas they had of stepping outside. They closed the doors in a panic, putting all the light out. The church was now within view. Atop the stairs leading to the building were two knights standing tall like statues, both dressed in elaborate gold outfits. Truth be told, they were actually just squires. It was only on guard duty that they had the chance to be armed completely like the church's paladins. Richard kept his sword by his side, charging all the way up the steps without hesitation. The guards had already discovered them. One raised his greatsword with both arms, while the other shouted loudly to warn of the invaders. Whoosh, another two arrows flew out from behind Richard, hitting the two guards. The one who had shouted to alert the rest was hit in the face, falling down, but the other managed to ward it off with his sword. Ola wasn't a professional archer. The faster he shot, the weaker and less accurate his arrows became. However, the troops on both sides overtook Richard, charging up the steps all the way to the entrance of the church. They used the momentum of the charge to slam their swords into the guard, causing him to tumble backwards. Two red gashes appeared on his chest, red blood gushing out. He fell back against the door with a dull thud, before collapsing onto the ground. It was only now that an alarm began to ring loudly. It was loud and filled with a sense of urgency, undoubtedly waking every sleeping soul in the city. Even Forza, who just laid down on his bed, sat up with a start. His face turned pale, and his heart almost jumped out of his chest. He ran towards the window, pulling apart the curtains to see fires raging in the direction of the church. The church is under attack by the intruders? Forza could not believe his eyes. The church gates were tall and grand, but they weren't particularly built for defense. The two trolls managed to crush them with a few powerful strikes, and Richard used the chaos and dust cloud to take a few steps forward and begin chanting. Two fireballs flew into the church in quick succession less than 3 seconds later, leaving it buzzing with alarm and chaos. None of the guards could make it in time to ward off the attack. Richard's line of sight was obstructed by the dust cloud, but that didn't matter. The spells had been cast as intended, and they were far from a shot in the dark. Based on the intel he'd received, if they weren't blocked they would land right in front of the altar, suppressing the church's divine power. In the partially sealed space, the fireballs could exhibit great power. Tiramisu, medium rare, the rest of you, that way. Richard pointed towards the right side of the church. The trolls, two knights, and Ola swiftly moved out, rushing towards the paladin's housing in the distance. The raptors dashed forward as well, a sea of black rushing across the floor. Waterflower took advantage of the chaotic situation, keeping close to the wall as she stealthily crept into the church. On the other hand, Gangder barged in with his large axe in hand. "Tremble, weaklings!" he howled, a knight with a huge shield following right behind to defend him if needed. This was a habit developed through numerous battles. After all, Gangder's eye-catching build and the fact that he was loud left him easy to notice on the battlefield. Richard and Flozan entered the church as well, seeing 6 fully armored paladins charging out from the pillars on both sides. Richard's eyes shrunk. How are there so many? It was late in the night, and all the paladins should have been resting. There had to be 3 or 4 taking guard duty at most, but 6 fully armored paladins had appeared at the time. However, one look at the situation near the altar told him why exactly this was the case. Even though the damage to the building itself didn't seem all that extensive from the outside, the scene in front of him perfectly showcased the destructive capabilities of his tactic. The damage was even greater than he had expected, leaving a sea of destruction before the altar. There were 7 or 8 dead bodies scattered around, and the statue of Nyan leant precariously to one side, the entire surroundings bathed in magic flames. It seemed like the attack had interrupted some kind of secret ceremony. There were only a few seconds between the doors breaking down and the advent of the fireballs, and with the first one having a delayed explosion, the damage had been dealt at the same time. This had left the officials who were performing the rites with nowhere to run to, completely defenseless against the flames. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 40. The Priest. However, one man was left standing amongst this messy pile of corpses. A man who had a very majestic appearance. He was of average build, but his sturdy body stood tall like a steel tower. His red robes were glowing with a holy light that even his shiny bald head seemed to emit. He had a prominently thick, short mustache, and his right hand held a bulky short staff with a valuable white crystal radiating divine power atop it. Even if he didn't recognize the iconic red mustache, the sheer power this man was radiating would tell Richard who he was. He was the priest of this branch of the Church of Valor, Eshin. All of the clergy that had participated in the ceremony had died to Richard's fireball, but Eshin hadn't been harmed at all. He had relied on the protection of his magnificent divine powers, but he hadn't been able to react in time to protect his comrades. Eshin glared at Richard, raising and pointing his staff towards the mage as he exclaimed loudly, "Hideous monster from another plane. Your greed and audacity will bring you endless suffering." Eshin's first words were already deafening, his voice as loud as thousands of people shouting in unison. A strange phenomenon occurred even before he could complete his words, the tilted statue of Nyan slowly returning to its original position. An indescribable fear suddenly hit Richard, and Flozin suddenly yelled from behind, "Don't let him finish. My powers are suppressed." Waterflower avoided a paladin to throw herself towards the priest, but Richard immediately yelled out, "Waterflower, come back." She was startled, but obedience was already an instinct, so she flipped around in the air as she returned to the paladin. The Shepherd of Eternal Rest slammed directly into his unprotected face. A fireball shot out of Richard's hands, aimed at Eshin's left rear. It landed without exploding, spiraling continuously in place as the destructive energies within grew increasingly violent. This was another delayed fireball. Eshin's pupils shrank, but he remained still as he furiously continued his chant. The holy power that had built up in the church for years was stirred by his voice, continuously gathering in front of his staff. The crystal began to emit milky white light that grew stronger and stronger, as if thunder was about to erupt. Another fireball whistled past him, landing behind and to his right, but even this did not explode. However, a mere second later a third headed his way. This one landed right in front of him, but it wasn't delayed. The 3 fireballs formed a perfect triangle with Eshin right in the middle. Eshin raised his fiery eyebrows, and it looked as if his heart had stopped beating. No more sound came out of his wide-open mouth, everything suppressed as the only thing in the hall seemed to be the ringing of the magical explosions. Boom! The 3 waves of fire broke out at the same time, a wave of heat sweeping through the church. The 2 paladins nearest to the fire were sent flying back, and even if Richard was outside the church, his robes were pulled close to his body. He clenched his teeth, resisting the dizziness from the sudden drain on his mana as a 4th fireball formed in his hands, also shooting out with a sizzle. A thick, bright beam of light burst out from the center of the explosions, spreading out to extinguish the magic flames. Eshen's figure was revealed when everything dispersed, still standing tall in front of the altar with his staff raised. Although there wasn't any holy light around him anymore, he was so majestic it seemed like the god of valor had descended himself. The priest turned to look at the hideous monster from another plane, but all he could see was a spinning ball of fire heading his way. It slowly grew larger, eventually completely filling his field of vision. Boom! Another wild explosion rang out, followed by a raging voice, "I curse you all." Eshen's body was tossed into the sky, crashing heavily into the statue of Nyan and tilting it once more. A deafening roar sounded as the statue slowly collapsed, several divine rays flashing from Eshen's body in the middle of the rubble. The priest leapt up, dashing through the back door of the church as he disappeared into the night. Richard was caught by surprise, only able to watch on as Eshen escaped. This fight had taught him a lot about the survivability of a high-ranking priest. Having launched 6 consecutive fireballs, he was too drained to pursue the priest. With the priest gone, the 6 paladins all around level 8 weren't his opponents anymore. Flozin managed to heal the injuries on Gangder and the rest, although still only able to cast normal healing spells. Even with the source of its power destroyed, the church still suppressed her abilities, and if not for the Book of Time she wouldn't even be able to heal minor injuries. Waterflower and the rest went looking for the defeated enemies without Richard needing to give the order, exterminating more than a dozen servants in the blink of an eye. They did not hesitate to rush out the back, surrounding the paladins' quarters where the battle still raged on. Richard remained alone, dragging his sword along as he walked towards the battlefield once he recovered a little from the discomfort. Although he did not have much mana left, he could still fight as long as he had his sword in hand. Moreover, both Gangder and Waterflower had searched around, so there was no chance of someone being left behind. After all, the thing they spent most of their time on in the Arkharan death camp was forcing prey out of hiding. The smoke and dust finally cleared up as Richard made it to the rear, and a flash of light suddenly caught Richard's attention. A pile of stone fragments had fallen on the altar after the statue collapsed, almost burying it, and the flash was coming a corner of a piece of paper under the rubble. Richard was shaken, walking towards the rubble to reveal the object below. The complicated formations of the altar had been destroyed by the fireballs, and it was no longer functioning. Richard could not recognize the symbols etched on it, the spell not something he knew. Anyway, what attracted him was that piece of paper. The page was unusually large and made of unknown materials, and had been placed at the center of the altar. It was jagged on only one side, indicating that it had been torn off a book, but it was completely blank. Even the statue of the god of valor had been destroyed under the bombardment of the 6 consecutive fireballs. And yet somehow, this page remained unscathed. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 41. Faith. Just the fact that it could withstand so much damage made this page a valuable artifact, but the church had closed up to secretly perform a ritual centering around it. Whatever that ritual was, the magic had to be related to the page. Richard snatched the page off the altar without hesitation, hastily folding it before keeping it on his person. However, when he released his grip, the page bounced open and reverted to its original position, without an inkling of a mark upon it. This page was twice the size of the pages in Flosan's Book of Time, and was in fact bigger and wider even than the pages of the Codex of Volusia that he'd seen in his younger days. It would be difficult to carry it around without folding it up, so Richard had no choice but to roll it up like a scroll before he could stow it away. By the time Richard made it out of the church, the paladins were almost completely exterminated. Gangder's trademark roars sounded out from afar, and his hungry axe scared the paladins like insects. It was needless to say that the squire's morale was depleted even further. Richard glanced up, and the first thing he could see was the brute weaving through the cold and cheerless battlefield as he destroyed everything in his path. His abilities seemed to have grown since the past battles, and the sheen of his popping muscles indicated that he was using the full strength his body could muster. It was obvious that both his offensive and defensive capabilities had improved. Even the heavy weapons of the paladins could only leave small superficial cuts on his body. On the other hand, each swing of his axe was so strong that nobody seemed able to withstand more than 3 hits. This was Gangder's true might in battle. During the battle at the reconnaissance base, he'd been stuck fighting Sir Menta, who was much stronger than him, and after that his enemies hadn't been powerful enough to bring out his full strength. He hadn't had many chances to display his skill. The 2 trolls were killing machines in their own right as well. They didn't use any special abilities, crushing their opponent's morale with their raw strength alone. This was especially true for Medium Rare, who was dressed up in armor so strong he was like an immovable steel fort. On the other hand, the paladins hadn't been prepared and had armed themselves hastily as they jumped out of bed. None of them had armor, while some didn't even have weapons. Faced with these 3 killing machines, the unprepared knights were massacred by the big axe and heavy hammers. It was a thorough feast of blood and meat, every movement of the big weapons letting loose chunks of bodies in big spurts of crimson. The remaining paladins knew that outside the base was a death trap, so they retreated to camp and tried to put on their armor behind cover. However, Waterflower and Ola had already made their way over. The elven bard was not skilled at melee, but the chaos proved to be a haven for the young lady who never wore armor herself. As for the squires, they were equally unprepared and none could face a single raptor on their own. Still, however, final victory remained difficult. The paladins were much stronger than the baron's army in battle, a product of their unyielding spirit even when faced with certain defeat. Even in their dying moments, they still found ways to injure their enemies one last time. By the time the battle ended, Gangder and Tiramisu had sustained considerable injuries. Even Waterflower had a deep wound on her thigh, and although Flozen had been present, one of the infantry was still heavily wounded. What's more, 2 raptors had perished in battle. As for the other side, including the 6 in the church building itself, all 30 of the paladins had died. Half of the squires had perished, while most of the rest had sustained major injuries. Only 5 or 6 had surrendered after losing the will to fight. The battle at the camp finally ended. Flozen cast spell after spell like they were water flowing out of her hands. They returned life to the soldiers who'd suffered grave injuries, and she also healed Waterflower's thigh perfectly to leave no scars. Even with mana comparable to 3 clerics of her level, she grew pale with exhaustion after healing everyone. Having already inspected the war zone, Richard was deeply shocked by this outcome. He was especially surprised by the tenacity of these knights and squires in desperate straits. It was quite admirable. By his original calculations, the paladins who were around level 8 to 9 just posed no threat to them, even more so because it was a surprise attack and they had run out of their beds without armor. The paladin's armor was complicated, and although its defense was exceptional, it required at least half an hour to don perfectly. And the difference between a knight with his armor on and without was like night and day. However, the final outcome of the battle differed vastly from Richard's expectations. If not for Gangder, Waterflower, and the troll's relentless pursuit of the strong knights, coupled with Flosan's sheer ability as a cleric, casualties would have been near unavoidable. In fact, if the raptors were taken into account, there were casualties anyway. As he looked on at the corpses on the floor by Flosan's side, Richard felt like there wasn't a single paladin with his body intact. He heaved a long sigh. This was a tough battle, but it's nothing out of the ordinary. They were men of faith. Flosan was so weak she could not stand on her own. Leaning on Richard's body, she nonchalantly remarked, "Those of strong faith do not feel exhaustion, do not feel pain." The battle at the church thus died down, and the city resumed its calm. Nothing seemed different, apart from the flames atop the church being extinguished. Most of the people awakened by the town bell hit at home, locking their doors and windows tightly. Even if this land hadn't been attacked in more than 10 years, the news from various sources left them able to control their unwanted curiosity. The ordinary citizens hoped for reinforcements from the garrison, while the scattered soldiers hoped for reinforcements from the Baron's elites. However, Forza remained in his ivory tower. The bridge had been pulled up long ago, and the gates had been closed at the start of the battle. These actions clearly showed his strategy. He had no plans to attack. All this time, hundreds of soldiers assembled at the gathered and armed themselves one by one. The titled knight in charge sat at the command building, with no plans to send them out as he kept asking them to wait for more to gather. He wanted more intelligence gathered as well, and anyone who suggested speeding up the reinforcement efforts was sent out to scout the enemy's situation. Some of the first parties that had set out did manage to return, but others did not. Thus, nobody brought up such suggestions again. By the time there were almost 200 soldiers ready to move, the church's alarms had been ringing for more than an hour. Flames started to shoot out from its direction, rapidly forming a conflagration that lit up more than half the port city and sent smoke billowing into the air. Baron Forza stood at the very top of his castle, looking into the distance as flames engulfed the church with a volatile expression on his face. Richard and the others had gathered at the public square in front of the church once again. This time, they had more than a dozen warhorses with them, some carrying weapons, others armor and spoils of war, all tied to their bodies. The church had been searched in a hurry, and anything that seemed to be of value had been snatched up. Apart from the strange page, the most surprising find was 50 polished mana crystals. There were also some rubies, and magical apparatus worth nearly 100,000 gold coins. Flozen especially gathered 2 boxes of manuals of the God of Valor, planning to start some research the next day. Lastly, there were many magic manuals that filled up 3 boxes. The spells of Nyan were not something that Flozen could invoke. The labels indicated that they just had some low-level magic anyway, so nobody could understand why she would want to collect such items. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 42. Reaping Rewards. From Gangder's point of view, these useless scrolls were just scraps of papers. If they didn't want them landing in enemy hands, their only option with only a couple dozen minutes to scour the battlefield was to burn them all. There were many valuable items in the church, and they would not be able to clean it all up and take it away. For instance, there were a lot of topaz gemstones embedded in the statue of Nyan. Eshen's scepter was incredibly expensive as well, but the crystal used to concentrate his spells had used up all of its energy reserves to defend him from the fireballs earlier, and had already turned to ash. The scepter itself was bent and deformed as well, but being made of gold, fine minerals, and some amount of obsidian, it would still be worth about 10,000 gold. Richard's time in the Deep Blue had made him a grandmaster at material usage, so he naturally knew the value this fight had brought him. In the beginning stages of invading a plane, pillaging and looting were the best methods to accumulate wealth. Although such actions necessitated blood being drawn, they were undeniably the fastest route one could take. Another special reward had been scoured from Eshen's room, a diary. Just the cover of the tome was so thick it took up half its volume, and the locks were guarded by complicated runes. If one deciphered it wrongly, the locks would immediately activate and turn the diary to ash. The intricate defensive measures alone assured that this book was not ordinary. A true, full-blown priest of a god in a foreign plane would definitely have invaluable experiences. Richard decided to take this diary back with him. The locks were a type of spell formation, and such things would not pose any trouble to him, especially when from a secondary plane. A single glance told him that deciphering would be an easy task, and the only thing he'd need to put in was time and effort. Although he didn't understand the runes and incantations of this plane, Norland was more advanced and its own spells much more complicated. Deciphering this would not be a problem, especially since this was a very traditional spell formation with clear effects. Furthermore, since the runes in the spell formation wouldn't be too difficult to crack, he could take another look at them later to help him understand the laws of this plane. That way, he could buy materials and construct runes that worked with this plane's laws perfectly. Richard got back on his horse, looking at the castle of the Baron who would defend unto his death. He felt a tinge of pity. Baron Forza had surprisingly grown either so clever or so cowardly that he'd shut his doors, not ambushing their party on the way. They'd been waiting for such an ambush, so this left them somewhat disappointed. However, even without the defenses of the castle, Forza had at least a dozen elite soldiers under him. If they fought head-on, injuries would definitely not be light and death was unavoidable. This was the greatest problem Richard faced right now. He could not risk losing another member of his party. The new foot soldiers were alright, but the loss of another knight would be too huge to bear. Even if he had a map of the Baron's castle, fighting head-on once again needed Flosan's energy to be restored. Outside of Richard himself, nobody on the front lines could leave her care right now. Without Flosan supporting behind them, they would feel that something was amiss when they charged in the forefront. However, Flosan already consumed most of her divine energy. A cleric of Flosan's level was often a second life on the battlefield, the amount of support she gave comparable to Richard's sheer firepower. The only reason Richard was above her was that his situational awareness and control of the battlefield allowed him to dispatch her from his side to the right locations at critical times. Richard looked at the garrison in the distance. It was dark all around, with no loud commotion coming from it. Had he not known beforehand that this long stretch of houses was a military camp, he would have assumed it was a settlement of commoners. During the start of the battle, several scouts had been dispatched over to check on Richard's party. However, with many of them shot down by Ola, no more scouts were sent. It seemed like the titled knight commanding the garrison was a smart person. If he was asked why he stopped sending scouts, the worst-case scenario was being dismissed from his post. That was much better than losing his life. Richard turned back to look at the burning church with a trace of pity in his eyes. The battle had generally gone according to plan, but the results were merely all right. Outside of the astounding wealth they just amassed, the rest of their results weren't all that spectacular. Eshin had escaped, and the Baron hadn't lost any of his knights at all. As for the paladins being eradicated, that was only satisfactory, and even then they'd sustained injuries. It was important to kill core members of the enemy army, which were those of high level, but that hadn't been accomplished. Let's go! Richard let go of his regret and waved his arm, charging through the castle gates together with the cavalry. The castle gates were wide open, and the obstacles that were removed were still in their positions. As for the corpses of the garrison troops lying in the sea of blood, nobody had cared about that. The war horses neighed loudly as they galloped through, followed by 2 trolls and a group of raptors. After riding for a while, Richard turned back and looked over. Flames were still licking the church, and from where he was he could see it engulfed by the conflagration. The smoke was thick, and it seemed impossible to put the fire out now. It was a fortunate thing that the area around the church was empty. If a fire of this scale were to spread, it could very well destroy half the city. Richard suddenly recalled the page in his hands, faintly feeling that it was perhaps the biggest bounty of the night. Before leaving, he ordered posters to be put up all the way from the city center to the gates. They all had the same information, telling Forza that the families of the 3 slain titled knights were in his hands, and he wanted a ransom of 5,000 gold to set them free. If he did not provide the ransom within 2 days, then they would all be sold as slaves. It was common for nobles to ask for ransom for prisoners of war. Most fights were not blood feuds, and it was rare for someone to just massacre an entire battlefield. Besides, 5,000 gold coins wasn't too much of a request, and was well within the Baron's boundaries. However, the decree of the God of Valor ensured that Forza could never agree to such a request. Richard knew this as well, but what he wanted to do was make sure that decision was known everywhere. The death of the 3 knights would already show the difference in their strength. Once they left, Richard released the raptors into the wild. He had them scout the area, preventing any chasing troops or upcoming ambush. The party was en route to Hoven, and 2 raptors were scouting several kilometers ahead, one on the left and the other on the right. They were already familiar with the route, and wanted to know what direction the troops in Hoven were heading. If any of them turned back to help save the Baron's land, then Richard wouldn't mind setting up another ambush to deal with them. These common troops would be tired from the endless travel, and wouldn't have much energy left. A blitzkrieg strategy with the raptors would end them. Flozen was slowly recovering her own mana, and with the vitality rune on him, Richard enjoyed an even faster recovery rate. He could also feel that the several difficult battles had left him on the verge of a breakthrough. He would become a level 9 mage quite soon, able to learn grade 5 spells. His experience left him confident of victory, which was the reason he was willing to start the battle with 500 soldiers. However, the knight leading the garrison was a prudent person who holed himself up, and it seemed like he had no plans to leave until the sun was up. From the distance, one could see that the fork on the road leading to the garrison was littered with barricades. Passing over Hoven, Richard could only wryly shake his head as he looked at the camp behind him. Sieging and eliminating these reserve troops would indeed be effective, and they wouldn't have to face any difficult battles, but since they didn't want to move at all, he was left with no choice. He could only change his route, moving back into the mountains as he prepared to digest the outcome of this battle. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 43. Visitor. By the time night fell once more, the party could see the mountain lake in the distance. Both Richard and Flozen turned to look up at the northwest, as a meteor streaked across the night sky to plunge to the earth. It was extremely dazzling, making everything else up there look dim, and the trail it left behind didn't dissipate for a while. Both of them had felt a ripple in spacetime, of the same kind that had spread when they'd stepped through the portal to this plane. A thunderous clap echoed through the tranquil night sky as the meteor landed, and with his eyes still fixated upwards, Richard felt many cryptic messages coming from it. This was a bellow of rage that caused lightning to disturb the quiet, and a commoner watching this would feel like the sky itself was falling down. Was this the wrath of the gods? Flozen and Richard exchanged glances, before the cleric spoke up. It seems like there's more invaders now. I wonder where they came from. Richard looked at the direction the meteor had landed in, calculating the location with the help of precision and searching for it on the regional map. The corners of his lips curled upwards. This is good news. Now we have more time, the gods of this plane won't be purely focused on us. That might not be true, my lord. It's better to be safe, Ola said in trepidation. Richard smiled in reply, there's no need to worry. No matter which party is heading here, they definitely will be stronger than a party like us who were just heading for a lesser plane. The gods will definitely be more wary of them than us. They'll just be high in level, Waterflower said icily. Her prey in the death camps were normally 2 to 3 levels above her, some even 4 or 5. Isn't that better? Richard laughed loudly. If that's the case, it won't be much longer till we get another valuable planar coordinate. Normally, only primary planes can open a passage to a secondary plane. The coordinates we get might very well be to a primary plane. Flozen spoke her mind. And wouldn't that make those coordinates all the more valuable? Richard asked indifferently. However, those who picked out the meaning in his words would feel blood surging through their veins. By the time they returned to camp, the new hostages were placed in captivity alongside Sir Kojo's family. There were close to 50 foot soldiers now, with several novice knights in the mix. The atmosphere in the camp had been extremely delicate. There were only 2 soldiers left on duty, sitting by the campfire with their weapons by their sides. There were 2 raptors as well, laid down somewhere in the vicinity. There were no lights coming from the tents, and it was extremely silent, but once Richard returned, many flaps opened to reveal that these soldiers hadn't slept. The strung-up atmosphere that seemed ready to break at a moment's notice completely relaxed. Seeing the families of the 3 slain titled knights and hearing of the infiltration and annihilation of the church, 3 of the captured knights finally chose to capitulate. This way, Richard would not pillage their lands for the time being. Richard split the defected soldiers into 3 groups, with one of his knights leading each. Several of the soldiers who'd killed for him before formed the backbone, while the remainder was filled with fresh faces. This allowed for absolute control over these groups, and at the same time would greatly enhance the effectiveness of his forces. The Arcaran knights weren't just good on a personal level, they had a wealth of experience in group battle as well. Staying by the lake for 2 more days, and estimating that the reinforcements from Jalion had almost reached Forza's lands, Richard made a surprising decision. He had all the hostages released, with 2 of the novice knights who hadn't defected sending the group of women and children back. They were given 2 carriages for transport, while the rest could only travel by foot. After sending the hostages away, Richard set off from the camp as well. The forces were split in 2. 2 knights took some of the defected soldiers on horseback to search for a secret path to the Direwolf Duke's lands, while Richard took the rest back to base. There were many materials to restock on there, and others that they would need to take later. The most valuable part of the base was the Lighthouse of Time, but sadly that was something that could not be carried away. Richard planned to rest in the base for several days, deciphering Eshen's diary. For now, they had time to spare. After lunch the next day, dust clouds set off on the road leading to Baron Forza's castle. Group after group of knights advanced steadily, their bright silver armor and crimson cloaks giving them an imposing aura. Behind the knights were roughly 3 times as many squires, armored soldiers who could hold their own in battle. Behind the squires were foot soldiers, most dressed in chainmail of wooden plate with various heavy weapons or giant shields on their persons. At the back were 100 longbowmen, their enormous bows each as tall as themselves. The army wasn't all that large, only about 500 men strong, but its gear and aura allowed it to quash Baron Forza's forces. Several golden red flags were hoisted up high, showing off Earl Jalion's crest. These flags had been through many battles, and any enemy who saw them would feel their guts shrink. Forza's scouts had already informed him of the procession. The Baron stood atop his keep, using a telescope to look at the distant flags billowing in the wind. His vision remained fixed on a black flag with a crimson axe on it, his lips pursed. Pirzij. Why is it him? Forza muttered, feeling a throbbing pain in his head. The problems he'd had recently were already more than enough, and Baron Pirzij's arrival would add another to the list. And he didn't know when this problem would leave. The Baron himself was at the center of the procession, dressed in his trademark black armor. The man had an extremely thin figure, with a flaky yellow face. The short, perfectly trimmed mustache didn't add an air of elegance to him, instead giving him a rather sinister aura. His eyes were always half-closed, as if he hadn't slept well the night before. But he remained upright on his horse, with no unnecessary movements. That revealed the aura of someone of true power. The group of elite troops soon reached the entrance of the castle, meeting with another caravan heading from a different direction. This one was led by 2 novice knights, with several tens of horse carriages behind them. Seeing the Earl's emblem, they immediately halted in their tracks and sent their greetings to Baron Pirzij, allowing his army to move ahead of them. The doors to the castle had already been opened, and Forza came forward with several of his retainers to greet his guests. Pirzij's gaze swept past Forza's body in an unrestrained manner, but what caught his attention was actually the horse carriages behind him. He raised his hand, and the entire procession stopped. Call the 3 of them here. Pirzij pointed at the 3 titled knights. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2 Chapter 44. Visitor 2. An attendant rode over to call the 3 knights, and they hurried over to Pirzij and stood respectfully before him. Baron Forza remained on his bridge over 100 meters away. It wouldn't be alright to go forward and receive the man, but not welcoming him would be improper as well. Who are those people in the horse carriages? Why are you here? Pirzij questioned them. His voice was extremely raspy, like the sound of wind passing between granite, quite unpleasant to the ear. The 3 knights looked at each other, before the oldest of the lot stepped forward to answer the question. These carriages carried the family members of the deceased titled knights, and Richard had let them go alongside the 2 others. They'd been sent to Hoven, where the knight in charge didn't know what to do with them and so gathered several tens of carriages and sent his assistant along with 200 warriors so that they could get to the Baron's lands safely. Baron Forza would make the decision. Pirzij nodded, so the rumors I heard were true. This means you two were captured by the invaders and then set free? Yes. We would rather die than surrender, and since those invaders needed the noble ladies to be protected, they had to set us free as well, one of the former captives spoke up. What about the rest? I heard some of them surrendered? Pirzij asked. There were a total of 7 of us held captive, and 1 died from an untreatable injury. Everyone but the 2 of us were subjugated by the invaders. Very well, I understand, Pirzij nodded once more. But then, he raised his voice, men, capture these 2. Several soldiers shouted in unison, moving forward to apprehend the 2 knights. They were startled, struggling as they cried out, we are loyal to the church and to the Baron. However, despite their resistance, they were simply outnumbered and could not wrest free from Pirzij's troops. They were hit on the back of their heads, to prevent their cries from annoying the Baron. Pirzij did not like noisy things. Send those in the carriages into Baron Forza's castle, Pirzij instructed a group of knights. It was only then that Pirzij took a look at Forza. He urged his horse over to the other baron's position, getting off with a smile as he nodded, my lord Forza, it seems like I've made you wait quite a while. He tapped the reins of his horse to his metal gloves as he spoke, as if he'd just come back from a hunt. Of course not. Forza forced a rigid smile. That nod wasn't even the most informal of noble greetings, and if he greeted his counterpart with propriety, that would acknowledge his own inferiority. Pirzij did not seem to mind the formalities, and his attention was no longer on Forza. He looked at the surroundings and said casually, so then, do bring me for a look around your castle. And arrange for lodging for my warriors as well. Also, I wish to watch the interrogation of the prisoners later. Prisoners? Forza was somewhat befuddled. He didn't remember any interrogation scheduled for that day. Pirzij turned back, holding a gaze into Forza's eyes so long that the latter's forehead glistened with sweat, those prisoners who secretly sided with the invaders. In that moment, Forza's expression grew extremely unpleasant. 2 hours later, a partially public trial was held in the Baron's halls. The ones being tried were the 2 knights who were released by the invaders, as well as the wives of the deceased knights, their 7 mistresses, 6 grown daughters, and 11 children. As for the 3 grown sons, they had already been slain. They had a blood feud with Richard, and he would not let go of people who were destined to hate him throughout the remainder of their lives. As for the sons who weren't yet mature, he did not worry about them, he had no interest in killing children. By the time the younger ones grew into enough strength, Richard would have stepped into a realm that they couldn't even dare look upon, and he would be back in Norland as well. If he wasn't, then he would have been turned to ashes in this plane. Those watching over the trial had some status in the baronage. The 2 surviving titled knights had been summoned over, and those familiar with the dead knights were present as well. Those in charge of the city were already here, so the hall was crammed with dozens of people. The ceiling of the dimly lit hall was very high, making it somewhat gloomy. The flickering torches did not make it much brighter, instead adding a sinister touch to the atmosphere. Baron Forza was seated at the head, with Pirzij in black robes beside him. The man seemed to drowsily adjust his collars, his gaze flitting across the hall. The hall was extremely quiet, and even the women being tried did not dare weep. Pirzij was well known for enjoying his peace, and the consequences for disturbing it would be severe. Pirzij wasn't just the top general under Earl Jalion, he was the man's nephew as well. There were rumors that he was a bastard child of the Earl as well, so no matter how many strange habits he had and how many people he killed, the Earl still heavily favored him. Looking at it from another angle, even if the 2 weren't related by blood, someone at level 15 was still a notable expert in the White Rock Duchy, and as a Baron, Pirzij was also a capable leader. There were 2 other generals under Earl Jalion with similar commandership, and a level 15 expert who was a little stronger than the Baron as well. However, Pirzij was the only one who could both lead troops and fight himself, so he was the last person Forza wanted to see. In fact, because of Pirzij's unique position and power, Baron Forza had no intention to get into a conflict with him. Not to mention avoiding conflicts, he would not even be able to reject any absurd requests the man had. If the fellow had been normal, he would already be a viscount. Piersage's demands were normally unreasonable, with no time given for preparation. The trial being held now was a good example. However, Forza was acutely aware of the consequences of not meeting those demands. 5 years ago, Baron Lowry's family had been exterminated for getting on his bad side. Jalion had only berated and fined Piersage for his misconduct, but even now half of Lowry's fiefdom remained under Piersage's rule. Forza listened expressionlessly to the stories of the knights and Sir Kojo's wife, and then looked at his subordinates who were quietly listening to the story as well. He then looked at Piersage. Piersage's half-closed eyes continuously swept past the people being tried, but he never turned to look at Forza. Forza knew that this judgment could not be avoided, so he gritted his teeth as he pointed at the knights and spoke in a deep tone. You have conspired with the demons. There is no further explanation needed, you shall be punished by hanging. Once the judgment had been made, a clamor arose in the hall. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2 Chapter 45. Visitor 3. What? My lord, we've endured endless torture. Our loyalty to you and the God of Valor are beyond reproach. The two knights were steeped in disbelief, and started yelling. They even tried to get to the platform. They turned into wild beasts, shocking Baron Forza into standing as he tried to get behind his chair. The judgment had caught his own guards by surprise as well, and they could not believe their ears. Unable to react to the horror of those words, nobody moved to stop the maddened knights. Only the loyal guard captain rushed to protect his lord, but he was knocked away by these two knights who were prepared to sacrifice their own lives. Forza himself was only level 8, and he'd long lost his wits. He had absolutely no idea how to deal with the current situation, and just as he was about to get caught he heard the loud sound of a sword being drawn out of its scabbard. The knight's fingers had just been about to reach Forza's sleeve, but the two were sent flying into the crowd, knocking down many of those in attendance as they fell to the ground. They were left unable to get up, crying in pain as they rolled on the ground. Blood continuously gushed out of their limbs. Piersage seemed to move very little originally, but he took his time easing his sword into its sheath. It was as if he was worried that the rest would miss the sharp edge of his blade. In but an instant, he'd cut the tendons and nerves of the two knights, robbing them of their ability to move. How dare you attack your lord? He asked, his voice cold and detached. You deserve to be minced meat. Most eyes fell onto Baron Forza, who was known by many for his reputation. Only he could challenge Piersage's authority here. Forza's face fluctuated between green and white, as he struggled in his mind. However, a faint tingling arising out of Piersage's murderous aura told him that this was a baron he could not oppose. If he angered the moody fellow, the man would have no qualms about annihilating everyone in this hall and claiming that they were cooperating with the invaders. Gritting his teeth, Forza spoke up reluctantly. Baron Piersage is right. You first collaborate with the demons, and now you attack your lord. Either crime is worthy of hanging. Drag them out, and hang them on the gallows. Even as the guards dragged out the two knights, they were still cursing and screaming. Forza returned to his position once again, the torturous episode leaving him weak and breathless. The chair felt like it was on fire, and he was unable to sit still. The silent gazes chilled his heart beyond measure, for he knew that nobody would come under his wings ever again. The worst reputation a lord could possess was of being incapable of protecting his subjects. And that was exactly what Piersage wanted to see. He laughed cheerily, approaching Forza and speaking in a low whisper. Sir Menta had a good relationship with me when he was alive, I could even call him a friend. With him dead at the hands of the invaders, I should naturally do something for him. I'll be expecting his wife, sister, and daughters in my room. Forza nodded expressionlessly, his actions incredibly stiff. A short while later, Menta's wife, sister, and 2 oldest daughters were taken to a room at the corner of the castle. The guards here weren't Forza's men anymore, they were Pierzid's knights. Menta's daughters were 12 and 14, both quite pretty due to their youth. After the fright from that judgment, they anxiously looked at the room they had been brought to. It did not look like prison. The door suddenly opened, and Pierzid stepped in. He stood at the doorway, slowly taking off his gloves as he inspected the women within. Menta's wife took a step forward in surprise. "My lord, have you come to save us?"